Well, Peter, it's a great privilege after all these years to be talking to you about your life and work. And I thought that perhaps we could start by asking you when you were born.
1924.
1924. Can you tell us anything about, or tell me anything about your parents and your background, your early life?
Yes, because I think it is significant in relation to anthropology, and being slow-witted, I only realised this quite recently. I was brought up in Merseyside, which is rigidly divided then between Catholic and Protestant. And also my parents were, my father was a very small businessman. He was an auctioneer and then an estate agent. And we lived in a lower middle class part of the Wirral. And I was always but his work, his sale rooms, auction rooms, were in Birkenhead, which is extremely poverty-stricken, depressed and proletarian in those days, and oscillating between petty bourgeois Worsley and proletarian Birkenhead. I was very vividly struck with the contrast of the misery of the people in Birkenhead. I remember, as everyone remembers, blind men with notices saying blinded at the Somme and their medals on, selling matches in the street. I mean, it's the classic Orwell kind of syndrome. And that, I think, gave me a sense of injustice and of the inequalities in the world. And what I didn't, then I went to a Catholic school, St. Francis Xavier's in Liverpool, but...
Were your parents Catholic?
No, they were mixed. My mother was of Protestant descent, but in those days you had to change at marriage. The Catholic Church would not accept a marriage. So she switched nominally to a Catholic faith and had to go through a period of indoctrination, but retained, of course, some resistances in her mind. And after a while, I was very unhappy at SFX. If you ever read Joyce's Portrait of the Artist, you will know about their discipline. Can I give a couple of instances? Well, they're very authoritarian. The punishment for the most trivial offence, like being late, was very, not always, but very often, to be struck on the hand with a whalebone ferrule, as it was called. Extremely painful. You might get 6 of those. The Jesuits, however, are very clever people, and they've invented some exquisite ways of dealing with morality. If you did good work, you would get a thing which was on a piece of red parchment-like paper, inscribed in Latin ad majorem Dei gloria, and it had a value, say 6 or 10 or 12 in the corner. And the idea was that you'd stored up merit in heaven. And if you were then to be punished for some terrible offence like being late, you could trade in the merit you'd stored up in heaven. Now, I regarded that, even as a young child, as extremely immoral, because I thought if you're going to be punished, then you should be punished, no matter how much one disliked the punishment. But the Jesuits had a special twist. You would trade in your red bill, and they would refuse it. Or, you never knew. It was absolute moral indeterminacy. And I think that was utterly disgusting. Didn't like the Jesuits, didn't like brutality, authoritarianism, and moral indeterminacy. And I think that may have made me unhappy, sometimes like physically ill. And my mother used to protect me by giving me sick notes all the time. Eventually took me away from the school, and I went to a marvellous Protestant, liberal, the classic case of a kind of Mr. Chips headmaster. Wonderful teachers who taught me history and English and told me why the First World War started and all kinds of stimulating things. But the process, you see, it meant that I was very much aware of a world which is parcelled between 2 different cultures. And when I began to Worsley Grammar School, this lovely school, I eventually became head boy. But being a Catholic, I wasn't allowed to attend the morning services, though I was head boy. And we used to go into a small room at the side with the Jewish boys and do our homework and tell dirty stories. And what else do boys do? So I was always very conscious of democracy and inequality, but also not just in democracy in terms of the rights of the majority, but of democracy in terms of the rights of minorities, because I was one of them. And I didn't realise this. That affected my formation until years later. And I think that's what makes me, probably, surely, sensitise me to other cultures, minority cultures, and people who are not like us.
Yes, I was thinking this is a classic upbringing for an anthropologist who feels between 2 different cultures. So you at the end of your school, you then decided to go to university, or?
Yes, and I did what I suppose most people still do. I had these very inspiring masters in English and in history. And having moved from a Catholic school, when I changed over, I discovered that I was 3 years behind in mathematics and 3 years ahead in Latin. So that ruined me for a science career, natural sciences. So I inevitably went on the humanities track and did very well at it. And so I went up to Cambridge and read English. So I followed what I was well trained at. I was a Leavisite.
Were you?
Yes.
This was just before the Second World War.
It was 1942.
When
I went there, yes, in Stalingrad. And that was the next crucial influence, of course.
But the fact that you read English, it's noticeable in your work that you place a lot of emphasis on literature and are interested in literature, and that was partly imbued through reading English at that time. I'm
sure so, yes. And of course, Leavisite English literature, English literary criticism was extremely social. Though it's elitist and all kinds of other negative dimensions to it, but I was strongly influenced by that. And
also by Eliot, or not?
And by Eliot, yes, and by Lawrence, and by Thompson, and the whole school of, we all might call it social literary criticism, that eventually flowered in Raymond Williams, I guess.
And then Stalingrad. What?
Then Stalingrad. Well, anyone who has a heart, as they say, was interested in the world in 1942, when all that stood between us and the concentration camps was the Red Army.
Is that how it felt?
Certainly. Churchill said as much. And he was right. It certainly felt like that. So it wasn't very long before I was in the Communist Party at Cambridge.
Was this, Cambridge is, perhaps I shouldn't ask, but at that time, or perhaps a bit early, it was notorious that many people joined the Communist Party, and many of them indirectly and subversively, well, not subversively, but
they became spies.
Secretly, yes.
Yeah, no, there's a completely different generation. Never knew any of those people, never had anything to do with them. They'd passed on and were in the higher establishment of the scientific service by then, I suppose, and Foreign Office. No, we were a lot of young people just come up, a surge of both of anti-fascist enthusiasm, commitment, and it's very difficult to realise now, but at that time it was extremely respectable, patriotic even, and I saw a film the other day of Lord Beaverbrook, I think, making the most positive statements about Stalin at the height of the war. And so it was a natural graduation. And then I went off from Cambridge into the army, and being a child of the elite by that time, if you'd taken your certificate A and certificate B in the, what was it called? It wasn't called the OTC, but it was the equivalent. Cadet Training Corps.
Combined Cadet Force.
We used to do a few weeks in the vacations. I got out of my second one and I went and worked in Pi's radio factory instead, making things for the war effort. But that meant automatic entry straight away into officer training school, officer cadet training school. And I went to Llandudno Wells and became a Royal Artillery officer. Bloody tough it was. From Cambridge, surrounded by guys who were almost old enough not to be my father, but who had experienced several years of war. And were in their 30s and had children and families, and I was a young whippersnapper from Cambridge going straight into being an officer. I got into trouble because I had never been on guard duty. I was put on guard duty one night. I did the wrong thing, and I was hauled up for the colonel, and I said, I'm sorry, it's the first guard duty. He said, okay, I understand, but don't do it again, because I was so wet behind the ears. Then I went into the anti-aircraft around various parts of Britain. It was the time of Alamein. I didn't need, the blitzes were over. We'd experienced all that as children in Liverpool. Blitzes were over, so they didn't need anti-aircraft, but they wanted men to die as infantry. So we were converted into infantry lieutenants. And in the middle of that process of conversion, they asked for volunteers to go to East Africa or to West Africa. I didn't know anything about either, so I think I flipped a coin and chose East Africa. Thought it would be somewhat interesting and exotic. And I went out there and it was marvellous. It was a very good war out there. The fighting was over.
You describe one experience when you first arrived outside Europe, when you arrived in Cairo, I think it was, seeing a man nursing something which looked like a football.
Yes.
That was a shock. I mean, that wasn't marvellous.
Terrible. Oh no. Egypt was a revolting experience. The degree of poverty and something mind-blowing. And when people talk about racism in Britain, which I've always believed ever since those days, is extremely deeply entrenched in the British population, one of the major sources of it was the direct experience of many, many hundreds of thousands of British troops, both in the First World War and in the Second World War, apart from the Indian and other armies, who experienced it firsthand. Two places in particular, Egypt and India, both exceedingly poverty-stricken. And the response of most of the British troops is to say that this condition is due to their indolence, stupidity, lack of Puritan ethic, all kinds of blaming the victim. They go home and they communicate that to all their families, kin, networks, and so forth, and it becomes, I think, a fundamental source of the deep-rooted racism in Britain. Many generations of it. The imperial experience.
And you had that shock too when you arrived.
Yes, but I was a red, you see. I was intellectually protected against that kind of thing. Otherwise, I suppose I might have absorbed it too. I remember when I went to India eventually, I actually made contact with the Indian Communist Party, and there's a large unrecorded history of that, because people like John Saville, my dear friend, and many others, Clive Branson, made those connections with India. John Saville took leave as a regimental sergeant major at the end of the war, took his 6 months leave in India and worked for the Indian Communist Party. Things went on like that, you know. Men going up to the front at Anzio told me that they used to walk up and down the train with hundreds of copies of the Daily Worker, selling them to the troops. Then there was the Cairo Forces Parliament, you know about that?
Yeah.
Well, part of the war effort was to inculcate a spirit of democracy and political education in the troops. And there was an elaborate, what's called ABCA, Army Bureau of Current Affairs, which promoted political discussion in the army. And as a kind of spin-off of that, I wasn't directly involved in it, but there was an elected forces parliament in Cairo. And I've forgotten the exact proportions, but we can put it backwards and say Conservative was about 10%, Labour was something about 60%, Communist was about 25%, and the rest. And that was the mood of the troops at that time. So that was a reddening experience, and after that I went out to India with African. I went to East Africa. Now that introduced me to Black Africa, and I was entranced. We learned Swahili on the boat going out.
Yes, I noticed you have a whole lot of Swahili dictionaries
from then.
in that period.
Well, the first few weeks we were there, we went to Jean's school, near Nairobi, and I think it was a few weeks course.
Jean LaFontaine.
No, it's called after some missionary pioneer, I think. It was the elite school like Achimota for sons of chiefs and other high Africans. But it was converted into a wartime place where officers were taught Swahili, and I did very well. I got something like 90% and got my lower standard Swahili examination within 2 or 3 weeks, I think.
Goodness.
And but I got interested in African languages and African culture. I realised there was an African culture, and I used to see these Kikuyu villages round about. We weren't even allowed to go in there very much, and of course all African urban areas were off limits to troops. You would be arrested. But I got to know the African troops, and I even learned a bit of Luo, mainly through language, because one couldn't study anything about their background. They were army soldiers. And I went out with them to India, to Orissa, Ranchi, and we were due to go into Malaysia, as it is now, Malaya, about 7 days after the war was actually terminated, and we would have been butchered. We were supposed to go onto these beaches in Malaya where the Japanese were sitting with machine guns and artillery all around the heights. We were to walk up the beaches. But one night, as I came back into the camp, I heard a tremendous noise of Africans drumming. Dum, 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 dum. So I said, what the devil's going on? And they said, haven't you heard? They said, the war's over. So I first heard it from the jungle drums.
That's
Marvellous. And then then I had this lovely job. I decided to enjoy the war after that. We went back to East Africa, and I had a lovely job taking African troops back to their natal villages, demobilization. And we went to very remote parts of Tanzania, Sudan, Uganda, and so forth, which is great fun and very interesting. And I saw a lot of village life. And so I determined to become an anthropologist by this time.
You'd heard of anthropology, had you?
I read a lot in the army. I bought books in Nairobi. I read Peristiani, for example, on the Kipsigis, Hollis on the Nandi and Maasai. Anything I could lay my hands on, which wasn't very easy, and there weren't many books in those days.
How had you heard about it at all? Because
anthropology?
I mean,
we would just go into the bookshops and look up the sections on Africa.
I see.
See, missionary bookshops there mainly were. And I read everything. I read Biesheuvel on African intelligence, and I really became hooked on anthropology. So when I went back, I said to my tutor at Emmanuel, I wanted to change courses, and he groaned and said, "Oh my God, you ex-servicemen," he said, 90% of you have changed your courses. Which shows, I think, that people just drift into the wrong thing at the beginning. Or there's a series of successive influences which direct one. So I switched over. As a matter of fact, that's not quite correct. I said I didn't think that they would tolerate my doing anthropology, which is what I really wanted to do. So I said I wanted to do sociology. He said, "We don't have it in Cambridge." I said, "Oh, thank God, can I do anthropology instead?" So I got what I wanted. But people are now dead, so one can say it. Anthropology at that time was in a shocking state.
In Cambridge, or generally?
Generally. Professor Hutton was the professor. He wrote interesting books on caste, as you will know, and about the Nagas. I remember most of us convinced that most of anthropology was about soul stuff. That if you cut off people's heads, you gain the potency, which you can then direct to your own ends. Hutton would go on about this for hours on end. We also had utterly appalling courses on material culture, which were risible, hilariously funny.
Who by? By Hutton?
No, by...
Gwilym Jones?
No, he didn't do them, oh dear.
Jack
The man
Shepherd.
who ran the museum, Bushnell, did some
Bushnell.
of them. Yes.
Why were they
Nice
so...
chaps. Oh, well, we used to do practicals and fire drills. And we nearly set the place on fire once, I remember. Frank Girling or somebody at the back caused an actual fire.
You mean fire drills as with...
We used the... Oh yes, it was practical course, it wasn't just abstract.
Not fire
theory.
drill as in rushing
No,
into a building.
drills that make fire.
Yes.
And then Bushnell used to take us out into the courtyard where the anthropology building is, and into the museum, and we would practice with blowpipes, so it was very dangerous. And with Australian spear throwers. I remember throwing one right over the building. It landed amongst all the cyclists in Downing Street. And very dangerous course.
Did you learn the Mongolian bow release? This was what Jack always used to tell us
bow
about.
releasing. And Godfrey Leonhardt, it was our examiner for the material culture, I remember. It was extremely funny because he thought it was a stupid course, and so did we, but he couldn't say so. And none of us were interested, very highly motivated, and he kept giving us quite illicit clues, and he used this huge, heavy spear. He said, "What do you think it could possibly be used for?" I said, "Well, you can't throw it, it's too big." No, he said, "It would probably be dropped from a tree, wouldn't it?" I said, "Yes." "I can't imagine on what?" And he said, "Well, what kind of animal?" And he was leading us all the time to the correct answer, which was a hippo-killing spear that you drop from a tree in Uganda. Well, we had that. Material culture, we had physical anthropology, of course. And of course archaeology, which I found very interesting. But now I am totally British in my attitude. I always alienate my American friends who believe in the four disciplines: physical, linguistics, archaeology, and social and cultural anthropology. I don't. We had to do all the physical stuff, which is of course interesting. But I regard it fundamentally as irrelevant. I'd much rather do something like history or whatever, some social science. And so much of it was a diseducation. And as for anthropological studies, proper social anthropology, I found some very interesting books. It was rather like as if one had discovered a hoard of dirty books, because they were hidden behind an iron grill in the professor's private suite. Professor Hutton, and I said I wanted to read these books from the Rhodes Livingston Institute by Max Gluckman. Could I please take them out? And he allowed me to. You had to get special permission. We called it modern anthropology. We didn't know, as against what we were taught. Now Hutton, for example, used to give a course on, I think it's called theory or something like that. And I remember him dealing with Freud. And he had a very strange mannerism, like that every few minutes. And he said, Freud. He said, well, there are many single-stranded theories. I mean, Freud's view is that human behavior is largely motivated by sex. Damn nonsense, he said. Who's ever heard of anyone making love when they're seasick? And there was a sort of level of the course. Well, eventually we heard one day that a modern anthropologist had been appointed to the staff, and we were thrilled, called Ray of Fortune. And he was a breath of fresh air, though Rayo was the most bizarre fellow too. He started his first course, and he said, physical anthropology, and had a mixture of a New Zealand and American accent. Physical anthropology and social anthropology, what's the relationship between them? He says, well, in the Chin Hills of Burma, he says, they have mortuary rituals in which they carry the bones of dead men around their chests. That's the connection. And we looked at each other, and we didn't know whether he was being serious, or there was something deep that we hadn't perceived. But he was most bizarre. He worked on free association. I went to Heifer's one day. They used to sell off, not a second-hand book, but second-hand off-prints. And I picked up some, bought them. I noticed two. One was on the lineage system in Polynesia, and another was on the ancient city of Kano in West Africa. And believe it or not, about 2 weeks later, Rayo asked me to write an article relating those two themes. He'd seen the two pamphlets together, and they clicked somehow in his mind. There's no relationship between them. But in a bizarre way, he of course had some very powerful insights. And one never knew whether he was being serious or crazy, or was just thinking beyond one. But he was quite interesting. Then G.I. Jones came from West Africa, really pedestrian, ex-government colonial official, but very good on land tenure, and that was his thing. Land tenure was the Igbo. So I had twice experienced at Cambridge a diseducation. The English department that I'd been in 1942, my tutor, H.S. Bennett at Emmanuel, told me not to go to the lectures by Leavis. He wrote very good social histories of Chaucer's time. Excellent.
And the manner, and medieval manner and so on. Yes.
Nothing about literature in them.
No.
I mean...
A bit of Paston letters, that's all.
Paston letters. Yes, basically social history. Told me not to go to Leavis, of course I went. But it worked with most people, because Leavis would get about 6 people. After the war, it was packed out. But the English literature was pretty dreary in the extreme. It was also arbitrary. The curriculum was very much Cambridge. It was what people wanted to talk about. So if I think it was perfectly possible to miss out huge slabs of major writings, authors, themes, and epochs. If somebody wanted to talk about second-rate medieval poets, because that's what they were doing at the time. Bad English literature, bad anthropology, and though I loved Cambridge, it was extremely wonderful ferment of stimulus, and one's colleagues, of course, one's fellow students.
Who were the students there with you? Can you remember? You mentioned Jack Billy.
Yes, I mean anthropology. Oh yes, Jack was a contemporary of mine, and Frank Girling. Now both of them I never got to know extremely well. Frank I did know because he also was in the Communist Party, and Frank had fought in the International Brigade in Spain. So I got to know him well. In fact, he and Ramkrishna Mukherjee and I did a culling of what there was in the classic Marxist text that might be of any use for anthropology. We all were given assignments and we did this. But I never got to know them personally very well because they were married, Jack and Frank, and therefore they lived with their wives in some remote part of Cambridge, not in the college, and they got off.
Garlic Row.
Is that it? Got off to take care of the kids and do the cooking or whatever they should have done. So, and also Kathleen Goff. She was about, I think, got a year or two ahead of me. Exceedingly, everyone adored her. She was so beautiful and intelligent. She'd romped through to her first. She was doing research. She was an absolute role model for perfection. But I didn't, you know, what it's like at school. The gap between 1 year and another is enormous. And 2 years is very big. So I never got to know Kathleen very well. The others, none of them became anthropologists, I don't think, if I can recall.
Godfrey Leonhardt wasn't, he was a teacher, was he, rather than a student at that time? Because I thought Jack and Godfrey were...
I did get to know Godfrey. I think he'd gone to Oxford by this time. I think so, yes. EP used to come over. That was the only ray of light. EP came over and he gave a course for colonial officers, which we were allowed to sit in. And it was marvellous. It was African political systems. And the second wonderful course was given by somebody outside anthropology altogether. That's H.A.R. Gibb on Islam, which was wonderful. A fine scholar. And I learned an awful lot from that. In fact, I learned most of what I know about Islam from Gibb.
Though he's very criticised by Edward Said in his...
I'm sure, as an Orientalist.
Yes.
Nevertheless, he told us what we knew nothing about. He opened up that culture. And I got to know something about the hidden imam and the different orders of Islam and so on, which is very important.
Who were the archaeologists? Was this time?
There was this man, Graham Clark,
Yes.
who writes, I think, very interestingly and in a popular way, but his lectures were really in the extreme. And I think it was he who'd just come from, he'd been in the 8th Army in Libya and had done some excavation out there, and he used to go on about these wretched sherds out in Libya for hours on end. I'm very anti-archaeology. I mean, I have a low threshold of tolerance for potsherds and stones, but all look pretty much the same. It can be made extremely interesting in its wide sweep, like Gordon Child, or indeed Graham Clark and Jack and others. Glyn Daniel was one of them, and at the hands of them, it was splendid. Glyn was my tutor for quite a long time.
Was he? What about Jack Trevor?
Jack was my first tutor, and I got on very well with him, and of course he did know some social anthropology, and so did Glyn. They were quite competent tutors. Nevertheless, they're not social anthropologists by a long chalk, and again, you know, it wasn't a very, very effective teaching. And after a while, too, I resent bitterly this arrogant upper-class Cambridge elitist assumption that Cambridge and Oxford are the centre of the world. Much as I loved being there, I don't think it is the centre of the world. My practical experience was that I had two lousy diseducations in two disciplines, and it would be a very good place to leave. And I don't believe that the world is populated and divided between intelligent people in Cambridge and barbarians outside. So I left. A friend of mine spotted for me in the New Statesman an advert for a new thing called the groundnut scheme. And I went up there and helped Britain lose £36 million.
236 million?
36. That's the title of a pamphlet that was written by a pseudonym, Elijah Wilkes, at the time. So I know a lot about aid programs and development programs. As I started in that, I had to go to an interview at Unilever House. The whole scheme was run by Unilever for the Labour government. And the rationale was that there was going to be a world fat shortage, margarine and soap and so forth. So it was a rapid-fire scheme to produce groundnut. And of course they had high-powered scientists, all the latest high-tech stuff, which was they used cut-down Sherman tanks, for example, to pull down the bush in Africa with the great big chains. I was hired, went for a selection interview at Unilever House with 40 other people to become teacher. The job was to teach basic English, because the groundnut scheme, being under a Labour government, and particularly Strachey, who had been a great left, though he ended up otherwise, thought that they couldn't reproduce the standard colonial enterprise, but it should do something for the Africans. So they were to be given decent housing, good health care, and education. And they were to be taught particularly English, and I was hired to teach English, but a special form of English, which was a modification of the I.A. Richards' basic English that had been worked with used in the Indian Army by a man called Adolph Myers, who subsequently went to Washington. And we went out to Tanzania, it was Tanganyika then, south of Iringa, to Ifunda, which was a technical training centre. The Africans were to be trained as mechanics, not hewers of wood and drawers of water, but skilled mechanics, and they were. That was the project. First, when the groundnut scheme went downhill, it went downhill because we had very good scientists called Lord Rothschild and other people who did experiments, as scientists should, with the equipment that was to be used in East Africa for farming, in Berkshire or somewhere. But unfortunately, the ploughshares that were used in Berkshire, the soil in Berkshire is not the same as the soil around Kongwa, near Dodoma, which is full of carborundum. And within a very few weeks, all this damned equipment was out of action. Huge parks full of it. Useless, high-tech stuff from the Western world. So the first year, there were some other problems. Kongwa it's a very arid zone around Dodoma, semi-arid. The Gogo, who inhabit that region, are semi-pastoralists with some gardens in the lee of the hills, low hills, because they knew that was the only place where, with any reliability, rain would fall. Not out in the plains, where it very rarely could be assured. And in 2 successive years, as far as the human eye could see, 15 miles of peanuts burned up to a cinder and lost, as I said, £36 million. They actually imported, they did run some Potemkin villages, because when Strachey arrived as food minister, they imported from South Africa sacks of groundnuts, which are exhibited as the products of Congo, which they were not. Filmed and shown on the British, I didn't have television then, on the British movie screens. It was a farce. There was a kind of social program run by a clergyman, I think an ex-bishop, at Kongwa, but we were teaching, and we found very rapidly this social program was the first thing to be abandoned, including our language teaching of English to the Africans. You see, teaching English to the Africans would have opened the whole world to them. They could read anything. So what did we end up doing? I wrote a basic Swahili program for the white engineers who'd been brought into the groundnut scheme to teach Africans to be mechanics and tractor drivers. So we reproduced the colonial business using, equipping these whites to control African labour. That's what it was. I was also visited by 2 extra members of my class from the CID, I subsequently found out years later, who had been sent down to see what Worsley was teaching these Africans. And they reported that I was teaching Swahili. So that was all right. Had I not been, I'd probably have been thrown out of the country. They used to open my mail regularly whenever I got a copy of any of my left-wing literature. It had all been found open in post, sort of pulverised. They have special machines that do it, and stick them down again. So, whereas the real scandals, rogues, and like the man who had been the head of the Funda Technical College, a training centre, was found guilty of embezzlement by the same CID people, fired, and within several weeks was the manager of a gold mine in Kenya. So if you're a politico, there's one law, and if you're a racketeer, there's another. So the first thing to be scrubbed from the groundnut scheme, cut, was the entirety of our program. I mean, that's just superfluous nonsense, all that social program. So I went home. No job, no money. My contract terminated a year or so before it should have. Well, I did have money. We were quite well paid.
How old were you by this time? You were 46, this was.
46, 22.
Still really young, yes.
Oh yeah. I had my 18th birthday in Nairobi, a night of V-Day, I think. And
so you arrived home penniless on the streets of...
Yes, no, but while I'd been in East Africa on the groundnut scheme, well, I still wanted to be an anthropologist. Now, there was no anthropology in Tanganyika. There was nothing in Kenya. Nothing at the time. I find it very difficult now when I meet Kamba sociologists in Milwaukee. I can't believe it. The only Kamba and Kikuyu I ever knew were peasants. However, I've got used to it now. There was nothing, but I wrote to the Roger Livingston Institute, remembering those dirty books from Hutton's day, and said, if you ever have any posts, or I really would be interested in applying. Never heard anything. of course, communications being what they were in Africa. Then at the end of the scheme, or somewhere during the scheme, we all went on holiday. A group of us took a clapped out old wagon, which we bought collectively, and went down to South Africa through northern Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, to Johannesburg, where I met Ruth first. So being a good communist,
I wondered why you'd dedicated your last book.
I was wildly in love with her.
Yeah.
Apart from her wonderful life. I saw the film about her life the other day and was very moved. A very good film. We went down there, so I saw South Africa. It's the only time I've ever been there, and it was really quite mild then. I remember coming back from a Communist Party meeting one night through the streets of central Johannesburg with Ruth and an Indian and an African and some other people being jeered at by what we would now call louts, Afrikaans-speaking louts, because we were simply together in the street, in public. Although it was a very peculiar Communist Party meeting, because it was a guy called Yanni du Plessis, I remember, was trying to stimulate these loyal communists to be more aggressively anti the system. Apparently they were not very not militant enough for him. So then we went back to Tanganyika and then home. And as a result, I also called in at Johannesburg to see another ex-DC who was the head of the department at Wits. I've forgotten his name now. He'd worked down in southern Tanganyika as a district commissioner, provincial commissioner, I think. There was nothing doing down there.
An anthropologist, was this? An anthropology department of sorts.
Yes, there's an anthropology department of sorts. There was a good one at Cape Town where Monica Hunter and Monica had been, Wilson had been. And so I went back home and I was called for an interview to the Colonial Office for a post. I think they'd gotten my name somehow through the Rhodes Livingston Institute application. I can't quite recall now. Anyhow, I was called for an interview. Max Gluckman was one of the assessors and a Colonial Office official. And they said that the job was going to be a study of race relations in Rhodesia. What was my attitude towards race relations in Rhodesia? So I said, I'm against it, morally, philosophically, intellectually, etc. And I explained why. So, rather surprisingly, at the end of the interview, Max said, well, you didn't get it. But maybe we'll keep in touch and good luck and all that kind of thing. Well, in fact, in about a week or two later, I got a letter from him saying he'd been now appointed to a new chair at Manchester University and would I care to put in for a research assistantship. I did, and I got it. On the basis, I hadn't explained, that when I was sitting in the Funda, in the groundnut scheme, I wanted to try and do some amateur anthropology, and I used to go out at weekends to the villages roundabout. Well, what can you do at a weekend, you know? So, what I did do was write a grammar of Hehe, the language spoken around there. Again, knowing no linguistics, but I taught myself, and there was an American with us who was a linguist, employed on this same teaching unit. So I did write a grammar of Hehe, and I was quite proud of it, and I did a lot of wire recordings of oral literature and music.
What is a wire recorder?
Wire recorder was the ancestor of the tape recorder. It was literally very thin wires, which had the unfortunate habit of coming off the reel and festooning all over the place in a most dreadful tangle. Sort of soft leadish material. Thank God they were superseded technologically. But when I went to Manchester, I was going to do an MA on Kiheya language. And after about 4 or 5 months working on it, he made me do some courses in Bantu language, linguistics for the other postgraduates. Vic Turner was one, Ronnie Frankenberg later, Freddie Bailey, a list of the great and the good. And so I did that. And he said to me one day, look, he said, if you're going to stay around here or be an anthropologist, you better become an anthropologist and not a linguist. So I said, all right then. So he said, unfortunately, he said, you've got one great defect. I said, what's that? He said, you were not trained at Cambridge. So you don't know any anthropology. And I was hurt. I was shocked to be told I didn't know any anthropology. And Jack Trevor had told me I would have got starred first. It was absolutely correct. I didn't. What he meant is I'd never read Miles Fortis or Evans Pritchard. I had read the Noah.
What do you mean when you said you weren't trained at Cambridge? You were trained
he meant I'd had a very poor anthropological education.
I see.
Correct, perfectly correct. I'd read the Yazandi too, but I don't know whether I understood it. So I remember going off, and he said, read Fortis, Silensis. So I did. I went off to Manchester City Library, isolated myself, and I read through that full stop by full stop. And as I went through, being a Marxist, it equips, it's an alternative view of the world, a counter-ideology, if you like. I couldn't buy this approach of Meyer's. And I started taking very detailed notes to try. I couldn't see. I was a reductionist Marxist. I was a primitive Marxist. I suppose I was an economic determinist. I hate to think of it now. But so I went through taking very careful notes about just how the hell did these people actually make a living, their farming practices and so on. How did it relate to the lineage structure, and how did that relate to their ideological structures of the Talis and the Namos? And that's how I came to write the critique of Meyer, which won me the Curl Prize at the Royal Anthropological Institute. I don't agree with it now, just as I don't agree actually with the trumpet will sound, because I think it was reductionist, and
does that mean you agree with Meyer, or do you
I think I agree.
or agree more
Well,
with Meyer?
no, Meyer's an idealist. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, the kinship system doesn't function as a kind of externalization of structural principles. It works because structural principles are built into a systematic sets of relations which are institutionalized in society, not just economic ones. But I think his approach in the end is mystical or quasi-mystical. But perhaps I could illustrate it much better, I think, with reference to the trumpet, which I came to write eventually. Although there's a lot of biography to go in first.
Let's leave it till then.
Should we leave it till then,
Yes.
right?
Mm.
So,
You were sitting in the library reading Meyer Fortes.
I was sitting in the library reading Meyer Fortes, and I thought, this is wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong about this whole approach, and I'm going to try and tease out what it is. And life was luxurious in those days. It wasn't like the ESRC whipping people to finish their theses in 2 years. You could actually have time to sit and think and do some serious work. And I think I sat there for 6 weeks in the Manchester Central Ref trying to figure out what was wrong with Meyer. And I turned it into an MA dissertation. I'm just trying to think. And that was the point at which I submitted. Max suggested he rather liked it. I submitted for the Curl Bequest Essay Prize, the Royal Anthropological Institute. I did, and I got it. Went down to London, and I had never met Meyer Fortes, and he was present. And he said, I don't agree with this. He introduced me the awards ritual. And I don't agree with Worsley's line of criticism, of course. However, let us agree to differ. And I made a few equally polite remarks, and it was a ritual occasion, and I got my prize. And after that I had the most positive relations with Meyer because he was a generous person. And we never really discussed Talency again. And I did subsequently apply to his department. He once told me that he'd very much like to have had me, but Jack got the job. No goody, because he was a sort of in-house Prince Regent or whatever. Line of succession and rather natural, and a West Africanist and so forth. So I stayed with Max and then applied again to the Rhodes Limited Institute. And this time I got it. I was appointed to a research post in the institute. But like the Bourbons, some people never remember anything and they never forget anything, and one of those is MI5. They stopped me getting the post. I was turned down on what was said to me. I've forgotten the exact phrasing now, and I think it was all verbal. I was given the post, but it was snatched back on intelligence reports. So I was doomed. After having worked on Africa from 1943 to about 1949, now 6 years, I was an Africanist through and through, besotted with Africa. It was the end of the road.
But at what level I suppose the Rhodes Livingston Institute was funded by the government, and that's how they could directly have it.
Well, there's quite a lot of literature on it now in the journal Africa by this chap Brown, who's on the history of the Rhodes Livingston Institute, which details the political interference by trustees and by political authorities.
We have all the papers in our basement. John
Do you?
Barnes left copies of all the letters and everything by chance. So
Well, see, Max himself was under a cloud. I mean, after all, a man who writes the research program for the Worsley Institute and calls it a 3-year plan or 5-year plan is asking for trouble, and says positive things about the USSR and its planning system. And his wife, Max, was never a Red. He was good anti-colonial, radical liberal, I should think. Mary, his wife, of course, was a member of the South African Communist Party, and much of their joint persona, as it were, was perceived as being Max's doing, but much of the political orientation was, in fact, Mary, who has always been an activist and has ended up significantly working for a trade union. Now she's widowed. But Max was a fine anti-colonial. His hour of glory was when he took on Sir Philip Mitchell, then the governor of East Africa, over the Mau Mau. And Max had the courage to defend the Mau Mau. Well, at that time, Kenya settlers were having photographic exhibitions of dismembered corpses in the House of Commons and telling everybody the stories, which were probably true, about how part of the Mau Mau ritual was the drinking of menstrual blood. Things which absolutely alienated the British public from the Mau Mau movement, which was, the leader to darkness and death, is what Mitchell described Kenyatta as. Kenyatta had nothing to do with the Mau Mau. Max defended it, an act of supreme courage, and later it became one of his radio talk programs, which became, I think they were the number 3 top radio programs after Tommy Handley's Take It From Here, and a few other extremely popular things. So can you believe it? Anthropology on the 3rd program. Max and I and Tom Boyer and other people and some very fine Quaker woman called Eileen Fletcher, who exposed the tortures that had been going on in the camps, went around various platforms in England, and I came in contact through that with the Movement for Colonial Freedom. Joseph Murumbi ran a rundown office just outside King's Cross down there. Later Foreign Minister of Kenya. I met him on an aeroplane years later. So I was very actively involved in the anti-colonial movement. Well, it was all to my undoing. They blocked me going to Africa. I could see it. So Max said, that's the end of the road. Why don't you better go to Australia?
Who told you that you were blocked? And
I think Max did.
He said, we have verbal reports.
Something like that. I have nothing on paper, and I don't keep records much anyhow. He said, go to Australia. Nardell's just been appointed the chair at Canberra, and you can apply for a research scholarship. I did. Firth interviewed me in London on behalf of the university. He was the dean of the new university, and I got it. Me and Ken Burridge, who also did a cargo book, as you will know, several. I went out there, and as Sheila and I were on the ship, one went on ships in those days, entered the Great Australian Bight near Adelaide. News came over the radio that Menzies was having a referendum on the outlawing of the Communist Party. So we looked at each other and thought, this is going to be a very warm landing. And we landed, and much to Menzies' surprise, and much to the surprise of political scientist researchers into the matter that I met later at ANU, it was decisively rejected. Wonderful victory for democracy. So that was the end of the attempt to legally outlaw the Communist Party. Now, that wasn't the end of their attempts to get rid of communists and all their doings, however, legally or illegally. So then I was planning to go, with Nardell's approval, to the Central Highlands of New Guinea. And I read up all the literature. And part of that process, I read all the district commission, not what they call, patrol officers' reports in the Department of, I don't know what they called it, Overseas Department, which is a kind of colonial office, which was run by a very strange man called Freddie Rose, who is at present retired Professor Emeritus at the Humboldt University in East Berlin. Fred was English, but lived most of his life in Australia, trained as a meteorologist, and had done a diploma in anthropology at Cambridge before the war. Went out, and to get near Aborigines, which is what he wanted like me, to be an anthropologist, he went up to Groote Eylandt. in the Gulf of Carpentaria, where there was a seaplane base on the route, Sunderland flying machines, from England to Sydney. It used to stop off and refuel and feed the passengers at Groot Island, and the huge base is still there. And Fred did his meteorology. What he really did was the kinship system of the Aboriginal tribe that were around there. And then he became an officer in the Australian administration, and he was the one I met. Well, I met him through the Communist Party, of course. But he helped me find these reports, and I read them all. And then, these are bad times. I've just written an article about this as a festschrift for Stanley Diamond called The Politics of Doing... It's really about doing anthropology under McCarthy. As Americans always think McCarthy only happened in America. It didn't. It happened everywhere around the world.
What date are we talking about?
We're talking
50?
about 1950. 50, it was awful. When Sheila was having a baby in the Canberra Community Hospital, I walked home that night and I rang through the hospital on the way back. It was a long walk. Said, "Has the baby arrived yet?" She said, "No." But she said, "Have you heard the news?" She said, they're going to arrest all the commies. The nurse told me this. So I thought, oh, this is not like give Sheila an easy birth, this. Went home, and there was my friend Bob Gollan, who later a distinguished historian, digging a hole in the garden and burying Communist Party literature. But we all expected to be in jail next morning. Now, I can't remember exactly at what point it was. I think what provoked that was the defection of a Soviet diplomat called Vladimir Petrov, who was a spy of the Soviet Union. About a week before that, I had got very interested in New Guinea, of course, and I discovered that the first European ever to arrive in New Guinea was, in fact, a Russian, Macfarlane. And I read everything I could find, which wasn't much, but I knew I had taught myself Russian, being a communist. I used to learn it on the bus going in and out of Manchester. I couldn't understand. I knew about who Tolstoy was, and I knew Dostoevsky and all that. I couldn't understand this guy Podgorka, who seemed to have very pithy sayings about everything, rather like La Rochefoucauld. You know, a Rolling Stone gathers no moss and all this sort of thing. I discovered it meant later proverb. So I learned Russian, and therefore I could read Sovietskaya Ethnografia, which is an awful journal. And however, I read it. And I did establish some connections with Soviet anthropologists like Potiekin, the grand old Africanist. In fact, I think it was Ronnie Frankenberg and I went down to London to meet him. He came on a visit once. He was later poisoned by, it is generally believed, the Portuguese secret police when he was on a visit to Tanzania. Died. He was a ghastly old Stalinist, but I remember asking the most naive, bourgeois, Western liberal, although I was a communist formerly, of the attitudes of my background. I said, how did a peasant son from the Ukraine become an anthropologist specializing in Africa? And he looked at me with disbelief, and said, the party sent me. So that was how Potiekin became an Africanist. So I could read Russian, read Sovietskaya Ethnografia, and I knew that there were some writings of Macfarlane about New Guinea that were not published. And all that. So I went to the Soviet embassy and spoke to the cultural attaché, and he got some things for me. Karkovets, his name was. This is about a week before the Petrov trial broke. And when the trial broke, I thought, my God, I've just been up in the Soviet embassy. They must have been filming all people that come in and out. I'll be in jail in no time. Well, I wasn't. Freddie went up on trial. They had it was the most illustrious trial. Freddie Rose, the anthropologist, colonial official, administrative official. Freddie was put on the box. It was the most distinguished trial. It was a trial, honour to be amongst them. It was a royal commission of inquiry into espionage. All distinguished, I would say everybody from the sort of slightly right of centre to the left were up there. Colin Simpson, who wrote a book about called Adam and Ochre and so on. He was put up. They were all put up there. Nothing was ever proved about anybody. Freddie was, because they weren't spies. Freddie wasn't a spy. It was ridiculous. What could they spy anyway? Well, I had great admiration for those Australian communists. Lovely people. Some of them war heroes. I remember Bob Michel, for example, got an American Silver Star. were fighting with the Hooks in the Philippines, and told me that he'd been fighting with the princess. And years later I met this princess. He'd been fighting with the princess and with William Pomeroy, Bill Pomeroy. I met them both. And she was indeed of royal descent, of aristocratic descent from one of these peoples, I don't know who. And, so they were splendid people, but we were living underground. And I have no apology for later, when I was in fact in trouble politically, it did break over my head. I would not admit that I was a communist. Now I didn't see why one should. Firstly, because of all the illicit tactics they were using against us. Secondly, because of the habeas corpus principle. If they've got any case to level against me that is based on a legal offence, let them put me up in court and try and prove it. We don't. We have the principle of the secret ballot. Similarly, we don't ask what your politics are. We have a belief in the right to privacy in certain matters, including politics, and I exercised that. In any case, I didn't believe in cutting my own throat. So I refused to make any statement, and it was a great principle in the McCarthy era in the United States not to make a statement. That was one thing one was supposed to do, not to accept this invasion of political rights. So we wouldn't do it. However, after the Petrov trial passed by and the farce of it, Freddie was fired, went off farming in Tasmania, and eventually he was married to a German woman, Edith, and through that they ended up eventually in East Berlin, and Freddie became professor of anthropology, and later wrote the most exhaustive and methodologically extraordinary study of a kinship system of the Ndlyagwa, which has got a matrix. It couldn't be printed in a capitalist society because the cost would be too big. There are about 100 pages of terms of identification by every Aborigine units for every other single person in the tribe of 450 people. The whole thing is on matrices at the end of the book. And Freddie's book is, has been said by Worsley and de Jong at Leiden, is in some ways a historic landmark in Australian studies. So he was no slouch, Freddie. He was a great expert on the pastoral industry in the Northern Territory and all other things he turned his hand to. But after the trial passed by, then came the axe. I was ready to go to I'd been down to Sydney. Sheila and I had spent a lot of money, ANU provided scholars with, on food for a year and all equipment for field research in the Highlands. I was going to work nearby where Mick Reed had worked. We'd been down to Hordens, ordered all this stuff, it was crated, it was going onto the ship. And so the day before, I had the last thing to do, I went into the External Affairs Department, that's what it was called. I said, please, can I have my entry of permit for New Guinea? They said, no, not you. So I thought, oh my God, it's the second time. I've been thrown out of Africa, now I'm thrown out of New Guinea, it's the end now, I can't become an anthropologist. However, as they're saying, we were discussing earlier, you know, about the French have, about these wild animals, they're wicked animals. Les animaux sont méchants, ils se défendent. Wild animals, they defend themselves, wicked creatures that they are. I thought, to hell, I'm not going to be pushed around by these people. I decided if I'm ruined, my career as an anthropologist is not possible, because you couldn't become an anthropologist without doing field work, of course. Then I'll pull the temple down with me like Sansom. And I went public, and my God, all hell broke loose. I was on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. The House of Representatives debated me. Harold Holt, the Internal Affairs Minister, Hasluck, who theoretically wrote one of the first books on Australian Aborigines, and quite a good book, a very conservative man. They all attacked me as a dangerous red. And
when you say you went public, you wrote to the paper saying that I've been refused permission.
I think I did. I can't even remember the sequence of events, but I let it be. I went, and luckily I practiced some democracy. I and a number of other students had set up an Australian National University Students' Association only a few weeks beforehand. We were only a handful of research students, and all of us joined, about 10 or something. And it took up my case. and took it to all the other universities in Australia, and of course it was quite a large scale Australian National Union of Students. That's, I think, how it became public. And it was pretty hellish. I don't know if you've ever been hounded by the paparazzi. I never want to go through it again, but they would almost lie underneath the bend. Nearly drove Sheila around the bend. It was miserable. I couldn't tap your phone, but they were on the phone all the time, outside the front door. She was in a bad way with it.
Really on the phone the whole time. I mean, they're constantly ringing you up and saying,
Got any statement to make? Well, you said this here, but, you know, trying to trap you into, to extend you into saying more and more and more, like secret police do everywhere. I mean, these reporters, same sort of technique. So.
And did you get much support from the department and staff?
No. Some persons I went to see, a number of them, like Manning Clark, the historian, and some people were very nice and sympathetic, like Richard Story, the Japanese specialist, and I went to see C.P. Fitzgerald, the sinologist, and I mean, everybody talked to everybody. They knew it was so tiny in those days, and I knew a lot about China through that. But my anthropologist, Nadil, really washed his hands on it de facto. Wouldn't do anything. Wouldn't make any statement of any kind. I think Firth just found me the most dreadful embarrassment. And Jean, what is her name? She later became Professor of Social Administration in Melbourne. But Jean, damn it. I was a poverty-stricken. We were the poorest people in Australia, ANU research student. We didn't even qualify for income tax. We were forced to live in the university hostel to keep them full, which took something like 3/4 of our income. So we had no money, and I had agreed, Jean Craig, her name was then. She later married a now eminent historian, and became professor herself, and he became professor. She had hired me as an interviewer for a project she was doing in Sydney. I've forgotten what it was. It was a sociological project, and she was absolutely. I was a poverty-stricken. We were the poorest people in Australia, ANU research student. We didn't even qualify for income tax. We were forced to live in the university hostel to keep them full, which took something like 3/4 of our income. So we had no money, and I had agreed, Jean Craig, her name was then. She later married a now eminent historian, and became professor herself, and he became professor. She had hired me as an interviewer for a project she was doing in Sydney. I've forgotten what it was. It was a sociological project, and she was absolutely furious when the news broke, and she said, "Do you realise that by making this public stir, you are prejudicing my research project?" And I couldn't believe my ears that anybody, confronted with a tremendous attack on free speech, should be concerned about her wretched little research project. Well, that was so. One didn't get an awful lot of support from senior colleagues. In fact, none. You had to fight it yourself. However, Freddie Rose said, "Look," he said, "why don't you go and study the Australian Aborigines? They're on the mainland. They live in reservations, reserves, but," he says, "it's very much more difficult to stop you going to a reserve." So he said, "Go to Groot Island, where I was." So I said, "Okay." Wrote off to the protector of Aborigines, Fred Gray. Interesting story. He'd been a pearler. The war came along, the pearling industry stopped. So Fred got himself, he had used Aborigines who were living in the bush, fishing for pearls, send them down, bring them up. And when that business ceased, he had a yacht, a lugger. He gathered these Aborigines into a place on Umbacumber on Groot Island and erected a settlement of Aborigines, and before long he was recognised by the Australian state as the protector of Aborigines for Umbacumber, with no qualifications, no legitimacy whatsoever. There was a mission down the other end of the island, CMS, which is Church of England. So, and the next stage is he gets financial support from the Australian state in the form of welfare payments for the Aborigines. But since they were not citizens, but dependents, wards of the state, and he was the protector. The money was paid to him. So he's got a nice income coming in. He also made him work, fishing, producing food, building dams, and collecting shells, which were converted into necklaces and dyed, very pretty, and sold in Sydney down south for large sums of money in the big department stores. So there was an economic base there. So he was a protector of Aborigines. Fred was a friend of his from the seaplane days. Wrote and said, this Peter Worsley's all right, let him in, he's a serious anthropologist. And Fred said, okay, come. So I went. And we got on all right. At one point when he was beating young boys, because some of them had stolen some turkey eggs out of the sheds they had there, I remonstrated. I said, I thought this was really too much for a minor offence like that. I mean, in any case, I didn't like kids being beaten up by grown men. He told me to get the hell off the island. Experience that most anthropologists go through. Some official or other told me to get the hell out. And I said, I'm not going. So I stayed, and it all cooled down, and I finished. But you see, having been an Africanist, and then having converted myself within, less than a year into a New Guinea Islander, which I really knew very little about, and I so did anybody else. Then, overnight, I had to become an Australian Aboriginalist. Well, you will know Australian Aborigines are difficult people, because they have these wretched kinship systems. And I found that it was curious. I didn't know what I was going to study when I went there. Fred Rose had studied the kinship system, and it's like a magnet, an intellectual magnet. You cannot study anything else. It is so challenging and so difficult that I had to do that, and that's what I focused upon. Later, Stanner, who was my thesis supervisor, said he was thinking of forming an elite group of people that knew about Australian kinship systems. And there would only be about 15, and they would meet once a year and have a dinner. And I can understand that attitude, because it is arcane in the extreme. But I think I cracked it. You don't want to go into this, do you?
Yes.
Oh, well. Well, Fred Rose's book, which is a classic, she argues that he doesn't bother much with anybody else's approach except his own. He's a most monomanic also guy. I mean, he's kept on studying them since 1938 through to the present day, and he's written several books and about the Groote Island, Wandeliagwa, and other Aboriginal groups. Just as Evans Pritchard went on writing about the Noor for a couple of decades. But I haven't got that. I'd like to move on to something new. Now, Fred had argued that the orthodox approach to Australian systems was algebraic, as Radcliffe Brown put it. That it could be reduced to a formula. A1 equals B1, B and the children of them are C2. You know, the classic formulae for 4-section and 8-section systems. And that's, I always found that difficult, because I've been demathematicized by this Catholic background. However, Fred took a completely different approach. He said, it's not algebra. He said, let's look at them existentially, on the ground, if you like. And if you look at the structure of the society, all power is in the hands of the older men. In fact, young men were not allowed to marry until they reached the age of about 27, 28, 29. And then they were handed over some old hag. That they're cast off of these older men who appropriated all the younger, beautiful, nubile women. There were also many other mechanisms for keeping them in a condition of inferiority, status inferiority. In fact, I almost laugh when I read about 19th century accounts of Australian Aboriginal society as communist and egalitarian, because I mean it's riven through with two gross structural inequalities, not of class, they're classless, all right, those of age and those of sex, gender. Women are excluded from the crucial decision making, and young men are kept in their place by God. Now all this has been classically shown in Hart and Pilling's wonderful book on the Tiwi. But Fred's approach to the kinship system per se was somewhat different. He hadn't got the insight that Hart and Pilling had, because he didn't work through the language for one thing. I did. Quite good at linguistics, and luckily though I'd picked what Capel, the reader at Sydney in linguistics, said was one of the 5 most difficult languages in Australia out of 500 odd.
Gosh.
It had in some respects certain structural properties which were unlike Bantu noun classes. So I could click into it. And I did publish in Oceania a comparative study of Bantu noun classes and Ndliagwa noun classes and Nungabuyo, Australian noun classes. So I was quite good at that. And it enabled me too to work through the language. But nevertheless, I basically followed Fred's methods. And I only had 10 months, 11 months in the field, with no preparation whatsoever, working on this ghastly difficult topic. And what Fred argued was that power is concentrated. It was a gerontocracy. And to understand the system, you had to see that women were pawns to be bestowed and manipulated. And that the logic of algebra couldn't work. Because the correct person to marry was your mother's mother's brother's daughter's daughter. Now, if you look at it demographically, this is a population of 450 people, very often there aren't any mother's mother's brother's daughters available or alive. They don't exist. So then you have to marry somebody who else.
Mm.
And that means you've got to change that area of the kinship terminology, because you're now might be marrying a woman even called your mother. So that produced constant realignments of kinship terms, and therefore the system was all out of kilter. It was not pure algebra. It wasn't an integral, logical, coherent and persisting system. Due to demographic variability, if no other thing. Now, later, and other anthropologists like Hart and Pilling and Lester Hyatt and others have shown that what I didn't even get onto, there's also a process of the politics of bestowal, as it's called, that the older senior elders use women to reward complaisant young men, and that they also use them in ways which got nothing to do with the pure logic of the kinship system. So that also causes a disequilibrium, a lack of. This argument goes on. There's been a subsequent man who worked on Grutan called David Turner, English guy now in Toronto, who he, however, went back to the beginning and produced algebra, a beautiful, coherent, interlocking system, which I don't believe in. So we now have Fred's account of the Ndliagwa kinship system, we have my account of the Ndliagwa kinship system, we have David Turner's account of the Ndliagwa system, and there are a couple of other minor ones, all different. And I think it's a perfect text for somebody to come along and do a definitive cutting of the Gordian knot of comparative study. Jocelyn de Jong tried something like this a few years ago in an extended article in Thailand, what's it called? Kunde. So I studied the kinship system. En passant, I was interested in all dimensions of the life of these people. Incredibly rich. I mean, a culture of 450 people is a culture. A very, very, very complex culture. Burns, Kathleen and Ronald, the great ethnographers of Australia, have written almost a book a year since decades, recorded part of one of the ritual cycles, of which there are many other kinds of cycles, amongst one of the Arnhem Land peoples, in 2 books, Jangawul and Gunapipi. It's only a segment, showing the most incredibly complex myths of the dream time, of the creation of the world, of the movements of the spirits and the persons who populated the earth at the beginning. It's the kind of order of complexity of what's his name's work on the Dogon. Griol and Ditolan, yes. That order of complexity. Now these are hunting and collecting people. Many people think of as savages, living like animals, and, close to nature. Incredibly sophisticated cosmological systems. And I couldn't penetrate into that, alas, because I wasn't allowed to go to the mission. because I was regarded as a dangerous red by the missionaries, where most of the ritual specialists were. My people knew about as much about their own religion as the average Church of England attender at church on a Sunday morning knows about transubstantiation. Nothing. At least they said they weren't. But I did work on some other areas, one of which I'm turning back to now. I would have some very negative things to say about the CMS mission, which also was singularly ineffective. I think the first recruit to the Church of England came after 20 years of a missionary endeavour. They were very puritanical. I remember when they used to visit us, we used to wear, like the Aborigines, just strips of cloth around here called nagas. It was scandalous. Heathenism, regression, atavistic. So when their missionaries came, we used to put trousers on. And they were not interested, as far as I could see, in any degree in Aboriginal culture, simply in replacing it by their own. Now, I have a deep apology to make to them, however, because in the last few weeks there has appeared one of the most marvellous books in anthropology. It could only have been written probably by a missionary. You and I go in for a year or two. In Evans Pritchard's case, or Margaret Mead's case, a few months. These people live there for 10, 15 years, and a woman called Dr. Julie Waddy has just produced under ANU auspices 2 volumes of the knowledge of the plants and animals by the Aborigines of Groote Eylandt, which is superb. She's a trained biologist. She has mastered thoroughly the anthropological literature and the philosophical literature on the issues raised by problems of scientific taxonomies. It's a wonderful book. And I don't think that any anthropologist, unless they're one of these people that goes back constantly, as some do, over a decade or so, could possibly produce that kind of work, the depth and the range of it. And it's a huge breakthrough for any studies, not only in Australia. But I, with modesty, pioneered that field. I was very interested in what they knew. Because I got a great shock one day. I asked the kids there was a school where they taught them nothing except catechism and hymn singing. But I gave them a test one day. I said, please draw me. They knew what the shape of the island was like on a map, because there were some around. I gave them outlines of the island. I said, please draw on it whatever you think would be of interest about this island. And its natural features or whatever, I leave it to you. I was absolutely amazed. To us, that island is featureless. It does have tracks, and there is a hill or two and a billabong, and nothing very much. It's just nothing man-made, of course. And these maps came back from the kids crisscrossed with lines. I said, what the hell are they? They said they're roads. Roads. To them, the entire island was intimately dissected and made up of known tracks and divisions. Whereas to me it was just an area of bush. And I started thinking about their perceptions of the natural environment. And I went back through all my notes and I started prodding them, asking them about plants and animals and their associations and what names they used for them and what connections they saw in the ecological contexts. And later on I wrote an article about it. Amateur, but I got very excited by pure coincidence. Well, coincidence being a communist and talking to a communist linguist, Peter Wexler, who had been at Cambridge with me. He said, we read this guy Vygotsky. So I read Vygotsky. Nothing to do with Groote Eylandt, I thought. But just about, it's in the Piaget mode, about the formation of concepts amongst the young children. And I thought, my heavens, this is the key to the problem I've been battling with on Groote Eylandt, where I found that there wasn't a unitary system of cognition or of taxonomy about animals and plants. Though you could ask them, if you like, they had got a scientific or a pragmatic material system. They also had a way of classifying according to the connection of these animals in mythology with them, as they occurred in myths, which were attached to particular clans. So that was a function of the social structure, as it were, utterly different from the kind of, what might I say, ethno-scientific one. And thirdly, there was the intra-myth connections of how Stingray in the creation time, the dawn time, moved around the island, stopped at certain points, met other animals and marine creatures, and they occur together in a myth. And that is the unifying frame. But there are three frames. The social structural frame of the clan, there's the intra-myth connections, religious if you like, mythology, and there is the framework of scientific analysis, which also has two dimensions, because it's also, they distinguish things that are relevant to them, that is, those things they can eat and those things they can't eat. So Julie Waddy, I worked this out quite well, as it turns out, aided, thank God, by Vygotsky. Wrote it in a Hungarian journal, which I did because I was still loyal, but that was just about the time of the Hungarian Revolution, and I blew up. And
it was in Hungarian or in...
It was in English.
Mm.
Edmund used to use it a lot at Cambridge. He was a great admirer of that article.
Edmund Leach.
Edmund Leach.
Mm.
I was, as a result of that, due to go to Hungary. I was going to the World Congress of Sociology at Stresa in 1958, something like that. And I was due to go on, I went by motorbike to Hungary. But just before I left, the Hungarian Revolution had started, and I couldn't stand that. So we all formed part of the new resistance inside the Communist Party, which later gave rise to a journal called the Riesner, which is an opposition journal, then the New Riesner, and eventually it became fused with New University's Left Review and became New Left Review. So I was one of the founding fathers. I was an editor of the New Riesner, which is a superb journal, still is, when I look at it. And though I have very little in common with the current New Left Review, I am a founding father. And why did I start talking about all that?
You were
Hungary.
on your way to Hungary.
I was on my way to Hungary. So I withdrew. I was going to Hungary to give 2 talks.
Was Hungary the first great shock? I mean,
To me it was, yeah.
I mean, Stalin was still not unmasked by this time.
Not to me. No, we all have our capacity for self-delusion, you know. No.
So it seemed to be going all right, and then Hungary came.
Yes. And so I withdrew I was due to give 2 talks in Budapest, but I withdrew them. I said, I'm not coming. So I never heard a word from them again. Except I did receive a telegram from my contact out there, was Tibor Bodrogi, who was at the museum and edited this Acta Ethnographica, saying I'd sent him a message, a telegram during the height of the uprising, wishing them revolutionaries, withdrawing my thing and saying that I identified thoroughly with the revolution. And I got to myself, I didn't know how he would react to that. Probably nothing. Silence. And I got a very moving telegram back saying, we are deeply appreciative of your solidarity.
I mean, I know not too little about it, but looking from the outside, you saw what I would have imagined one would have seen was a Russia which one still believed in, threatened by subversion of one of its satellites. Why did you identify with the revolution?
Well, what everyone's attitude to Russia, it was patently a massively popular revolution against all kinds of horrors, which very rapidly became patent and explicit. And
one could see that from here at that time.
Oh yes,
looking back
yes. Well, somebody like Dora Scarlett, for example, went out there, I think, for the Daily Worker as a reporter, and been imprisoned for many years. First she knew about the Hungarian uprising and she saw the courtyard in the prison was full of statues of Stalin. Had been removed from public places. That was at the time when Khrushchev started. So we revolted with the Hungarians, and the scale of it, I mean, was gigantic. It clearly was an incredibly popular revolution. And then we started asking questions. Why? What was wrong with our Marxism? What was wrong with the Soviet Union? And that sparked off the whole explosion of the New Left. And it was a massive movement, you know. The New Left was a very significant factor in its day. You don't want me to go into this?
Yes.
Well, the New Left Review today, in my view, is a Mandarin journal, specialising, although it's improved greatly in the last year or two under Robin Blackburn, but under Perry Anderson's aegis, and I have the deepest intellectual and scholarly respect for Perry. I think he's not far short of a genius given his years. I think his historical works are wonderful. What he did with New Left Review, however, was to convert it from a journal of mass movement into a very arid, esoteric journal, which could only really be comprehended if you had a PhD from the Sorbonne. New Left Review was important not only because we had at one time 40 or 50, what do we call them? They were usually focused around coffee clubs and cafes, and we used to have them at the Marquee and 100 Oxford Street jazz clubs, and they were very popular. Supporters groups, and we used to go all over the country talking to them, and there was a movement, because not just us, but it was also the time of the beginnings of CND, and we immediately identified as CND, and we indeed wrote, I've just written an article about this too, it's coming out shortly by Versa, by New Left, on the origins of the New Left. We became very prominent and intellectually significant in formulating many of the policies and ideas of the what was the biggest mass movement since the Chartists. So it was big stuff. It was a popular movement, and for the first, under Stuart Hall's editorship of New Left Review, to run up to about, I think, number 20 or something like that, the journal reflected that character. It was concerned with popular issues about what's happening to British society. It was concerned with cultural issues which had never been talked about by Stalinists. And that's where we made contact with Raymond Williams and Richard Hoggart. And we used to have art discussions and movies and everything. The whole of human life was there. And people liked it. It made a tremendous impact. And then, I think very bitterly, and Edward Thompson has said this in his Poverty of Theory book on Althusser, it was converted into something almost its intellectual opposite, an arcane, specialist, highly Marxist, which a New Left Review wasn't. It was very open, and as Gellner wrote in an early issue, for example.
Althusserian.
Pardon?
Althusserian. I mean, his influence was obviously quite considerable later on.
Oh, later, yes. Well, they became quite influenced by Althusser. And that's the point at which Edward Thompson exploded and felt he had to write the blast. And he wrote it, which is, of course, it has faults, but basically I'm certainly on his side, absolutely. So that was the New Left period. That was a result of the Hungarian Revolution and of the decay, disintegration of the Communist Party in this country, which now scarcely exists. It's down to less than 10,000 divided.
Were you influenced or sympathetic with the others who became disillusioned with communism? The two great ones I read are Orwell and Koestler. Had you read either of them?
Oh yes, of course I'd read them. I think I personally would have been much more ready to sympathise with them. First, Orwell in particular, because he did carry on fighting, literally. Edward was always extremely hostile to both those people, and I think partly influenced me, no doubt because I partly deferred to his tremendous charisma and intellectual power.
Edward Thompson.
Edward Thompson. I mean, the most amazing guy. So we never gave Orwell and Koestler much run, and by that time, after all, they have a long, long way from socialism, except some very wretched kind of parliamentary stuff up in the Hampstead. And they were, from our point of view, unspeakable right-wingers. So I think that's really why we didn't know. We felt no sympathy for them at all. And they were another generation, a totally different experience. And the kinds of explanations, in any case, that they generated in the novels and other works of Stalinism didn't seem to us at all adequate. Powerful as they were, it was creative literature. So no, we weren't influenced by them.
Were you from Hungary, were you beginning to doubt? I mean, what was the sort of central doubt about what had happened in Russia? And was it Stalin or was it something deeper?
Of course it was something deeper. How could it possibly be? any person. It was an institution, or the entire structure of society, especially the role of the party and its dictatorial command over the entire society. The elimination of opposition and the whole bit. Monocentric society, and then that required you to examine why people put up with it, what had happened to the opposition, pulverized brutally, how many millions or tens of millions killed.
When did you begin to realise that?
Oh, only after Hungary, really. Yes, I mean, you can certainly say, well, we were blind. So I think I've become a lot more humble since. It forced us into a total re-examination, both not just of that culture, but of our own, and of our own intellectual equipment, of Marxism. And that's when the debate started taking place about socialist humanism and what was wrong with Marxism and what would be something better to take its place. In those period days, I used to write a lot in the my main role actually was as commentator on colonial affairs, anti-colonial affairs, and particularly Africa. And I wrote a very well-known article about Mau Mau, and trying to explain it in terms which converge with what I was going to write later about the cargo cult. In that, I was saying that in order to understand these, to whatever extent one subscribed to the belief in their credibility, these apparently brutal rituals of induction that were practiced, especially as you went further into the higher ranks of the movement, one's got to look at them in terms of kinds of solidarity they were trying to express and to build. And in fact, they were horrific also to the Kikuyu, who were breaking sacred taboos and thereby, as it were, steeling themselves to do anything, like even fight and kill the whites. And it's that kind of line of argument I developed. And then I also wrote on against a saint of the liberal establishment, Albert Schweitzer, pointing out that he wasn't, and at great length. And it brought the house down on my head from the kinds of people who are benevolent and very well-meaning, and to whom he is a saint. I think he's a bloody old colonialist. Although a dedicated man who was given his life, medical service, gave his life in Africa, but his attitudes were appalling. Well, those articles create a lot of attention. Now, that's in the whole journal. Now, when is this? This is 56, 57.
Yeah. Yes. In fact, you wanted to say something more about...
Why we've been so stupid.
Yes.
Yes. Well, you really cannot appreciate what Stalingrad was like. I remember going to school earlier, 1940, about May, and the English master who so influenced me said, I shouldn't say this, it's unpatriotic or something, but I cannot see any logical, rational reason why we'll be in a position to have a class next week, because there's nothing to stop the Germans rolling into this country. And one was living through some pretty cataclysmic times, and Stalingrad was the next major nodal event. And it showed us that what we've been told for years and years and years, that the Red Army was a myth. Tanks were all made of cardboard and they'd collapse if you pushed them. And they fought, and they were evidently made of steel. Also, we've been told for decades that there's a brutal oppression inside the Soviet Union, and the minute the population got the slightest chance, they would rise and revolt against Stalin, and they fought to the death. Now, one can talk about why, but to us it seems to suggest that an awful lot of what we've been told for years and years and years about the Soviet Union was nonsense, propaganda, and these were our heroes defending us from destruction. So I think this is very important to understand about loyalty to the Soviet Union, for people of that generation in particular. That's all I want to say on that.
Right. So then you sail back from Australia. You'd got a PhD now from ANU in anthropology. You came back looking for
A post.
A post in anthropology.
I can't say I'm very proud of that PhD, but how could I be? I'd done, what, about 11 months field work, having no preparation at all. I had had to write it between November and... I got on the boat in July, during which time we'd given birth to a new baby, which doesn't help. And up night after night after night. And I wrote it, and I suppose, what's that?
Had
Sheila
Sheila been there with you?
Yeah, she was in the field with me.
How did she find it?
The field?
Mm.
Well, she was very stoical, having no interest really in anthropology, I have to say. And she busied herself with people, human beings, especially the young children. And she always is busy and finds interesting things to do. And but she didn't directly help me. She wasn't any kind of amanuensis, and I wouldn't have wanted her to be.
But she wasn't desperately unhappy? Or?
No, she wasn't. Except physically, because the climate in monsoon was awful.
Mm.
But most of the year it was lovely.
Mm.
It was glorious.
And you had a reasonable place to live. Were you in the
Oh,
colonial era of living in a bungalow and this sort of thing, or were you?
well, the Aborigines lived out on the sand, as they always have done, with, at best, if they bothered, what they call shades of paper bark over their heads. Lived in the open. They didn't have water. The protector of Aborigines, Fred Gray, had a beautiful big concrete building with all mod cons, kerosene fridge, cool, etc., and ovens and stoves, everything pretty well. And we were given a room in there. So we were living in a quasi-colonial relationship.
Mm.
It was the only relationship would have been allowed, of course.
But it was still that sort of halfway stage where it was a sort of 9 to 5 thing. I mean, in the evenings it was drinks in a cool room.
Oh, it wasn't that elegantly colonial. I mean, we were, simple North Australians. We wouldn't have had drinks to dish around.
But when one talks about sort of later hair shirt participant observation type of anthropology, we're actually sort of living in the mud hut with a family of the people. You obviously couldn't do that.
No. At night, very, very often, I would go. If I'd hear the didgeridoo going, I think, I wonder what that's for. And I would go up and chat. Sometimes I just go for sheer sociability to see my friends and informants and so forth. Sit around, talk, play with the kids. And of course then from time to time something significant did happen, like major rituals. And would stay there day and night for as much as possible. But by and large it was visits at night time.
Yes. So Deborah was born just on the way back.
Yes, and according to Aboriginal way of looking at things, she was conceived. She must be belong to the West Wind Para clan because she was conceived in their territory. I'm naturally the classificated brother of my chief informant. So if she ever goes back, she has a territory and rights.
Does she know this?
She does. She's very proud of it.
One day she'll go back.
Yeah, and she's been to Australia. Unfortunately, never got back there. Yes.
Have you been back?
No, I'd ideally like to go. I really wonder whether even now they might let me in. Fred Rose has had very considerable difficulty, but Fred is extremely provocative. He courts trouble and he insults the Australian government and all sorts of authorities. I think he wants to show his loyalty to East Germany where he lives, that he's not being bought over by these bourgeois influences. I don't have to prove anything like that. So I don't know what I wonder, because subsequent researchers like David Turner, it's been written about, innocent, and he's not a political activist or a difficult person. He offended, however, the missionaries. Probably wrote things about, they have developed a counter-religious cult of their own, some of them, the minority phenomenon. He's written about that and certain things that maybe the missionaries found this too unacceptable or sensitive. But he was later refused entrance back after his first large period of field work, and this must have been in the, I don't know, 60s, early 70s. Ostensibly now, not refused entrance by the mission, but by the new Aboriginal Council, which I suspect is simply masterminded by the missionaries.
So you haven't been back.
No, not
Anyway,
been
you're
back.
on the boat coming back. You're right.
Coming back from Australia, yes, and hearing about the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu on the way.
Did you? Oh.
Got back, I looked around for jobs, and of course I'd been at... I'm sorry, I'm getting confused, let's start again. When I got back, Max... Sorry, I really am... We're in 1956, 54 now.
From your first return from
Yes.
Australia.
Ah. Well, of course, I had gone out as from Manchester as a MA graduate and a protege of Max Gluckman's. And my dream in life was to get back to be a protege of Max Gluckman because it was the most wonderful experience anyone could have had.
Why was that? What was there about Max that was so wonderful? I heard he was an overbearing sort of...
Oh, yes, he was an authoritarian personality, but a nice guy. He was so intellectually powerful. I mean, his capacity to turn his mind and to turn anthropology to anything was quite, for me at that time, quite astounding. Now, if you'd have asked me to go, I nearly went and worked at the Worsley at one time in a ward of schizophrenics when I was so desperate for a job. I'd have found it, I think, quite difficult to know how to approach that kind of utterly untraditional research project, a task. Max wouldn't. He had 10 ideas before breakfast. And he proved this, because he actually did start up sociology, or at least anthropological studies of Britain. Tom Lupton was the most best known of these, industrial studies, and the woman later became his wife, and many others, excellent. And urban studies, Derek Alcorn and others. There was a whole core. Now the intellectual, these guys were perfectly competent in their own right, of course, and experienced. Nevertheless, Max, as he did with the anthropology studies, infused them with his own strategies, one might say, ways of looking at things, so that people went into factories looking for fission and fusion and conflict and coherence and symbolic identities and all the clues of what to look for rather than being told what they would find. And it all turned out damn good work. Of different in kind from most sociological work, which is, of course, usually based on much more distant and documentary sources, materials. And although I don't suppose that tradition didn't persist, I can't say it has done, nevertheless, I think those were very, very interesting studies. And that was impressive about Max. And he could turn his mind to contemporary, social and political issues, like the radio broadcasts. And indeed, ordinary listeners to the BBC, and even to the third programme, which is regarded as rather an egghead programme, and found this tremendously illuminating and exciting. And they were bestsellers, his books, based on those radio broadcasts, rightly so. Talking about these are Zandi and their witchcraft oracles. What on earth would you think any ordinary person would be interested in something like that for? But by the time Max Gluckman had finished, they were. They could see indeed what it was all about. And one of the things they could see was not only that these people were tackling problems that we also have to confront, but tackling them with ways perhaps very different from ours, but equally understandable and rational. And that's one of the great classic anthropological messages. And he was wonderful at that.
He was a good lecturer.
Superb, and he knew it. And he was a superb, in every way, teacher. He could take, doesn't matter if Srinivas had come from India, cultures with which Max was totally unfamiliar. He'd have some way of looking at it, of suggesting perceptions, modes of analysis which the guy would immediately respond to. I'll tell you a guy who had the same gift was Victor Turner, who was a colleague, a contemporary of mine. I was at Brandeis when Vic arrived to give some lectures, and Vic had been at that time just come back from Mexico, I think the second time. Short periods in Mexico, but during that time he wrote some very seminal things. They're now debated, very interesting, on pilgrimages and so forth. And Vic gave one of his characteristic lectures, which went on for at least 2 hours, probably 3, very difficult to stop him. but nobody wanted to stop him because he was entrancing. I've seen him start seminars in Chicago at 11 o'clock at night, and about 3 in the morning I had to go to bed, but the others, graduate students, were sitting on the floor riveted and not missing a full stop. Vic talked about Mexico, and this was a Mexicanist department at Brandeis. And at the end of this second long lecture, one of them said, well, I have to say, he said, I've been studying Mexico for 14 years, he said, and at last I've begun to realise how I should go about looking at it. That's a wonderful tribute. And Max had that quality. And he was very democratic. He was authoritarian but democratic. We were a tiny group of apostles. So we would spend all our time together. We'd have coffee together, we would have lunch together, we'd come. Max used to make us work in his bloody garden like helots. I mean, notorious. But it was close. It was face-to-face interaction with a vengeance. And he also made us interact with each other. If anyone came, as a constant flow of people from northern Rhodesia, Zambia, of people coming from the field, like Victor Turner or Ian Cunnison, not Vic, Bill Watson. And they'd come, there'd be 10 special new seminars put on, and we were in a whirlwind of stuff, and also fresh, brand new. And we were collectively really working on how we could make sense of all this. I remember sitting in particularly Srinivas's, what came out to be the Coorg book. And I knew but nothing about India, though I'd been there. And I found it riveting and absolutely exciting. And we were all involved, and I think we all did, in fact, in different ways, contribute something towards those discussions. And that was wonderful. It was, and although Max and Srinivas were very senior people by then, and with long research experiences behind, they treated us, for all practical purposes, as intellectual equals. Even though there was this authoritarian aspect to Max. Intellectually speaking, it was a different thing altogether.
He was a person who would change his mind if you made a good point to him.
Yes, he would. He would indeed. And he would also, of course, the other important characteristic of supervisors and tutors, he would be very supportive, obviously in practical ways, like finding money, but in encouraging you. I mean, he said to me, put that MA in for a Gold Prize. I would never have dreamed of anything so arrogant. And he said to me, we come to the trumpet shall sound, for example. I went back, and I had written my PhD, which was not marvellous. Published a few things on Australian Aborigines in Man and so forth, and American anthropologists. And but I was still bitten by, and somewhat frustrated, because I had prepared myself to go to the New Guinea Highlands and to New Guinea. And the big thing in New Guinea at that time was cargo cults. And I had collected a lot of material. I wasn't, of course, able to go into the field like Peter Lawrence and Ken Burridge, but I discussed with them at great length their field results when they came back and read all their materials. And one weekend, this is typical of Max's yeast-like stimulating role. It was as an outcome of the Mau Mau incident, confrontation with Sir Philip Mitchell. Max became known as the great expert on the Mau Mau, which he didn't know much about, of course. He'd never worked in Kenya. But he was modest. When it came to intellectual matters, he knew when he knew something and when he didn't. So it had given him an interest in movements of protest, especially amongst colonized peoples. And of course, from his African knowledge, going back to his Zulu studies, he knew a lot about similar phenomena in Southern Africa and Central Africa. And he conceived the idea, and he was a man by this time well established in social sciences and popularly known. He meets all sorts of people. He arranged a special weekend. He said, not on the Mau Mau, but he brought Eric Hobsbawm to talk about what became primitive rebels. He got Norman Cohn to talk about his medieval movements, and he got me to talk about cargo cults. By that time I started. And it's one of the most exciting weekends I've ever spent in my life. It was marvellous. We just gave 3 papers, I think that's all, I think that's all. And out of that came 3 what I think are cracking books. Eric had always had you wouldn't believe it now, a bit of a blockage about writing. He was known to be a genius and a polymath and spoke 90 languages. there wasn't an awful lot on paper. But he wrote this fascinating set of essays on these Italian millenarian and other kinds of protest movements. And from that moment, he never looked back. And books poured out of him. And
what did you? I mean, can we just pause a moment on Eric?
Yes.
Since we're
Yes.
past. I mean, you've mentioned the enormous influence and admiration you have for Edward Thompson. The other person who is of that sort of league, to my mind, is Eric Hobsbawm. Do you? I mean,
absolutely.
do you admire him? And
Oh, he's marvellous. Yes, yes. He is incredible. I think he gets, in some ways, better as he goes on. I mean, recent books, which are not in the field of British historiography of the 19th century, brilliant as that trilogy is. I mean, think about The Invention of Tradition. What a mind-blowing, mind-expanding work that is. Also hilariously funny and iconoclastic. Wonderful. And, he's a great jazz man.
I was going to say, you have an interest in
Indeed,
jazz.
I did. I was a great guy. And nearly at one stage was told I might have become a jazz critic of the New Statesman.
You were?
I know. Eric wasn't he, for a time?
Yes.
Yeah. But, Eric, a great hero, intellectual hero. Amongst Marxists, I would put him and Perry in Britain, and others like Christopher Hill, of course. Now, it's of some interest to say this, Alan, because you're an historian, but I produced, was come to later on, a book on the three wills. Christopher Hill reviewed it in The Guardian. I didn't know he was going to review it. And he said, Peter Worsley's books are triply interesting, he said. The guy is not only an anthropologist, but also a sociologist, and though he probably doesn't know it, he's also has an historical vision. And I think I have, probably because, in part, of my coming under the influence of a wonderful history master at school, and I think we all seem to assume that life starts at university. It doesn't. It starts in school as intellectual life, and I'm very aware of my formative influences there. So, yes, Christopher and the classic school of historians, Rodney Hilton. People like that. But Eric and Edward and Perry, that's my trio.
Yes, there's
my
your
troika.
And the greatest of them shall be not.
Oh, as a scholar. Well, it would have to be between Perry and Eric Hobsbawm, because Perry isn't finished yet.
No.
He's quite a young man. There are 2 more volumes, I think, to come, if anything like the first, on that alone. It's really the history of Western European capitalism, isn't it? I think they're magnificent. Yes, so we had this weekend, and out of that, well, I must have started already. I decided I was going to write, not just carry on like Evans Pritchard would do for 10 or 20 years writing about the Noor. I would carry on for 10 or 20 years writing about the Groot Islanders with exiguous field material and equipment in general, and the great difficulty to try to maintain research interest in Australia at the other end of the earth, which I'd only been forced into faute de mieux anyhow. I decided, Max was approached by a young left publishing firm, McGibbon and Key, which has now disappeared, to write a book about the Mau Mau, which was big news, Max Gluckman on the Mau Mau. And he modestly said no, he didn't think he knew enough about it. But he said, I've got a young student here who has got writing a book about something analogous. And that's how Trumpet Shall Sound came.
I suppose it's an obvious point, but there seems to be a shared interest just at that time, just as the sort of last echoes of colonialism was disappearing, with all this and the New Left Review and the Trumpet Shall Sound kind of interest in millenarian movements and nativistic movements all around, just in the late 50s, early 60s. Your excitement of suddenly finding Hobsbawm, Cone, yourself, and then there's the Thrupp collection, wasn't there?
Yes.
Comparative.
Well, it's what is it? It's colonial resistance, isn't it? And it's this is the period of the disintegration of colonialism. We're just on the eve of the winds of change, 1960, in Africa in particular. It was the dominant form of political action on the part of the ordinary people of Melanesia in the Pacific. I could see that, and had been for 40 or 50 years. So yes, and these are very far removed from the more familiar movements of revolution and resistance, like in Vietnam or Russia or China and so forth, which were largely within the perspective, ideological framework of some Western ideology like Marxism. These weren't. They were utterly different. We had to, but they were very real, very important, and we had to try to come to terms with them intellectually. And I think that's what we were all grappling with.
You said that the thesis of that now, looking back, you weren't sure whether you agreed with it.
The trumpet. No, I don't really. The trumpet starts off with chapter 1. The formation of the colonial world in New Guinea, of the colonial structure of society, and it deals with the creation of monocentric colonial institutions with the governor at the top, and the plantation system, the economy, political economy. Perfectly valid. When you read years and years later, Peter Lawrence, field worker, produced his carefully thought through book. The first chapter isn't exactly entitled this, but it's what it means, the Melanesian worldview. Peter Worsley writes a book. The first chapter is political economy, colonialism in this area. Peter Lawrence writes a book called which the first chapter is the Melanesian worldview. I think they're both right, and both have their shortcomings, because the way I see it now is that it's a dialectic between the two. You certainly have to understand the incredible impact the coming of colonialism, German or Australian or English, meant in New Guinea or anywhere else, and describe it, explain it. But how do you explain the response to that? Colonialism occurred all over the world. It occurred in South America, in North America, in Asia. In some places the response was liberal in terms of Western liberalism, demand for parliaments and adult suffrage, of native rights. In some places it became socialism, or even later revolutionary Marxism. It took all kinds of forms. So those forms are not dictated by the inherent logic simply of political economy. They were dictated and created, shaped by available cultural materials and ideological frameworks and perspectives, which included cargo cults. Clearly. So both Lawrence, I emphasise one side of the dialectic, Lawrence emphasised the other. Now I think threaded all the way through my book is quite rich investigation of Melanesian perceptions and modes of understanding and intellectual frameworks. But I myself systematically at the beginning of the book didn't, as the French say, plant that problem quite as clearly as I should have done, and I didn't express it in the form of a dialectical model. I think I now would do. And that's the same kind of autocritique that I would make of the work on the Talensi, my criticism of Maya Fortes. I think, again, it overemphasized the material dimensions of social life amongst the Talensi, and simply almost treated what Maya talks about as such rich way of the lineage structure, institutions and lineage ideologies and ancestor and earth culture simply as somehow derivative epiphenomena, by-products. It's a base and superstructure model and quite inadequate. So that's what I now think of it.
You probably didn't hear Salins' British Academy lecture recently, but it was really very similar. It's interesting that he took Melanesia and he took China, and he suggested, as a lot of his recent work has done, the way in which Western capitalism, if you take the idea of diffusion of Western capitalism in something that concerns you later in the Wallerstein model, as just sweeping everything before it and having the same effects, it's nonsense. You've got to see it as this dialectical process whereby it's interpreted by McCartney's mission and those who met in McCartney and those in the islands, in each case differently, and it has a different effect in each case.
Absolutely. I think McCartney mission is a classic statement. It's on page 1 of my Third World. I first ran across it in Canada and I was bowled over at the heliocentric arrogance of this emperor who was actually wrong. But wonderful contempt for the West. And when people come to me with these kinds of one-way models of basically periphery, centre-periphery, I think it's one word: Iran. Explain the Ayatollah Khomeini in terms of your political economy. And they cannot. There's no way they can. They've got to start talking about Islam. Thank you very much.
So, you came back. We'll go back to nitty-gritty. You came back and you looked to Max for hoping to be able to rejoin him.
Yeah.
But?
Well, I wrote The Trumpet Shall Sound, very successful. I was extremely lucky. It was reviewed by Geoffrey Gora in The Observer, and he said, wonderful book. The Guardian praised. I think by this time I was reviewing for The Guardian. I think that arose because I had the Old Boy Network. A guy who'd known me at Cambridge as an anthropologist had become it was on the staff of The Guardian. I think he recommended me as a reviewer of anthropology, and I did dozens and dozens of reviews for The Guardian. I became quite well known that way. And they've tended to peter out over the years, and I think when they're desperate, they fill up with something. They occasionally send for me, but very rarely. But I enjoyed that. The money was very welcome too. I was impoverished. But I always wanted to write for a popular audience. One of my ambitions, which will forever remain unrealised, is to write a book which will be sold on station bookstores. And I thought I'd hit it when I went to China and came back and wrote a book, which we might talk about later, but it wasn't as successful as that. Anyhow, after The Trumpet Shall Sound, it swiftly became. I applied, as I'd earlier mentioned, I think to Cambridge. There was nothing. There were no posts in those days. It's like now.
Meyer he'd been there a few years, not very long, and it was slowly expanding.
Very slowly. The odd post every few years or something.
Yes.
So it was quite clear, not only there were very few posts, but Max finally put the blunt truth to me one day and said, with your political reputation, you're not going to get a job in anthropology. I said, Max, you're quite right. So that's when I started trying various other possibilities, including studying schizophrenics at the Worsley, and thank God I didn't. He said, well, you should switch to sociology, which was just beginning to lift itself then. I said, all right, and I think perhaps the first job I applied for at Hull, with a very strong competition from Andrzejewski, a very good guy from the United States, Henry Landsberger, demographer and Latin Americanist, Paul Halmosh, who later became Professor of Social Administration at Kiel, and I can't think who else. They picked me out. I don't know why, because an anthropologist had been studying, it probably helped that by that time my book had not been published. I'd done a broadcast on the BBC on the third programme, Cargo Cults, and that broadcast came out about 2 days before the interview, and it may have perhaps turned them. The other guys are proper sociologists, I was not. So I then spent the next hard few months trying to read enough sociology to keep 2 hours ahead of the students. I really knew very, very little. And I taught them a lot of anthropology under a course called Comparative Social Structures. We were working to the London External BSc in Social Sciences at the time. And I had a very good young colleague, Gordon Horobin, and together we slowly built up very good popular courses. Then sociology started to explode, and so did the universities, of course, with the Robbins Report. And we had a huge department. And I don't know how many people we had there. By the time I finished there in 64.
You went there in
56. I was there 8 years in Hull. Very big department, quite prestigious. Some people thought well of it.
And you were head of it?
I was head of it, eventually became senior lecturer. And about a year before I left there, Max had managed to get Manchester to approve of a chair in sociology, which they hadn't had. I went for interview, and so did other people, and didn't hear a thing. I got a phone call informally from Max saying, well, they decided not to appoint, so we're going to wait and see. So I didn't want to leave for all kinds of personal reasons at that time. I was quite happy at Hull. And about 1 year later, out of the blue, I got a letter from the Vice-Chancellor Max saying, you have been appointed. I thought, thank you very much, I haven't even been asked. But of course I went. I was really too good to be true. A major university like Manchester that I knew well, and great love for. Wonderful. And I was a Northwesterner as well. So I went, and the expansion of the universities and of sociology exponential, which produced great problems sooner rather than later with Max himself, because he had thought he could control this as a kind of junior ancillary wing of his empire. And firstly, I don't like to be treated like that by anybody. Secondly, he did really try to restrict the amount of sociology that was made available, and conversely to stipulate that all students would have anthropology whether they liked it or not. And sooner or later it came to a sort of territorial battle, you know. It was really very sad. And a lot of hostility between anthropology and sociology, and we of course won because we were the subject in demand, more or less won, and we went from strength to strength, so much so that after a few years the Dean of the faculty came to me and he said, Peter, we just can't go on like this. We can't have a faculty who's going to be 60% sociologists. A very distinguished economics department, large economic department with possibly nothing to do with all that. So I said, no, you can't, it's ludicrous. And we put a ceiling on sociology. Later, Mrs. Thatcher put a ceiling on sociology, so that problem solved itself. At least the student revolution put a ceiling on sociology. So there I was sitting with a large department, and
Who else was there then? It was Brian Robertson.
Brian came fairly soon. The situation was so desperate with the Robbins expansion. There were I think at least around 10 new universities in a year. I was getting phone calls at Hull, and later, even after I moved to Manchester, would I like to move to X, Y, Z and several other places. I said, no, I've only just moved here. And in any case, I like it here. A lot of potential. I was reduced to the situation once. I had a new post in sociology available. I mean, in those days, the Vice-Chancellor would give you what they call a couple of honeymoon posts. He'd say, here's a couple of posts, you know, fill them. Just to, with the kind of people you interest to, well, I want to support. I rang around a lot of universities and said, have you got anybody, a warm body, intelligent, remotely capable of teaching sociology? And it was jolly difficult to find anybody. Eventually I found, Jenny Halsey said, yes, I got this brilliant young PhD based back from Chicago called Brian Roberts, and he turned out to be jolly good. Later converted himself into a Latin Americanist. We had Baldo Pons, of course, also came from across from anthropology, had an anthropological background.
When did Theodore?
Theodore came a few years later. Do you want me to talk about Theodore?
Yes, I gave a sly smile there.
Well, I had a letter one day from him. He was at the Russian Centre at either Birmingham or Sheffield, I think. Got a letter saying, I am very interested in peasant studies and also a specialist on Russia. By that time, I'd been sent out in 1965, a year after I got to Manchester. The only time I've ever been recruited by the establishment through a rather radical person who has now gone off to Harvard. Which is his name, economist, recommended me as a man with a knowledge of East Africa, anthropology and so forth, for a British Economic Commission on which was connected to a project to give Tanzania a lot of money, aid. So being Tanzania, I agreed. And somehow, I don't know, my political past was regarded as tolerable anyhow. And I went out there and wrote a report, and I got interested in cooperatives. I was studying particularly the predecessors of what became the cooperative farms and eventually the Ujamaa collectives, which are a disastrous story. So were the ones I was studying, the disastrous. So I developed, however, interest in cooperatives, rural development, and because of that, what? Oh yes, I wrote a book. I participated with Ron Dahl in staging a conference at Sussex IDS on cooperatives in the Third World and development. I wrote a long introduction to it, and that drew the attention of Theodore, who was one of the participants. And so he wrote to me and said, I'd like to come and talk to you. And I thought, oh my God, I don't talk to some white Russian emigre who's going to blow down my ear about the horrors of communism and the horrors of collectivization, which I was by that time thoroughly aware of. So I wrote back saying something like, I'm terribly busy, It didn't make any difference to Theodore, because the door flew open one day, off practically off its hinges, and he said, I have come! And this 6-foot figure, not only with this tremendous personality, impressed, but he taught me more in the next 2 hours about peasants in the world than I'd ever thought of in the whole of my life. Brilliant! So then I read his thesis, and I became a kind of backer of Theodore, patron. Got it, we helped to get it. I think he got it published. The Awkward Class. I think he got it published, I don't think we did. But I got involved through him in peasant studies, and he and I together did a lot of work on editing, though I don't speak Polish, some Polish writings on peasants and change of peasant society in Poland by Galensky. And then eventually the possibility of a second chair arose at Manchester, and he became one of the candidates, and I don't want to go into all the details of the vicissitudes, but he won it. And so that's how Theodore came to Manchester on his merits.
He's always remained that overwhelmingly larger-than-life character.
Oh, I was just in Brazil recently, and there seem to be two subjects of conversation. One is the terrible effect, the shock that everyone was experiencing of 2,000% inflation, and the second was the visit of Theodore Shining. Yes, he's a great guy.
At what point you'd gone to Manchester, where was it that you wrote The Third World?
I wrote that in my last couple of years at Hull. In fact, I did the index to the thing in the first week I was at Manchester, sitting in a little squalid room, sent it off, and they lost it. And I had to, in the middle of the first week of term, a new post, starting a new department, I had to sit down and write out a new index. De novo, because I hadn't kept a copy. So I wrote it there. It was published just after I arrived in Manchester. It was published in 64. I arrived in Manchester in 64. So, it's quite good to have a new book, well reviewed by like Shills and The Guardian. And that made me a Third World man. In fact, the Third World man, with all modesty. In the Anglo-Saxon world, the French had invented it. And that took me really... I remember talking to the director of, was it Nigel Nicholson? At Weidenfeld. And I said something which I think was quite modest about the book. I said, people do seem to have found it interesting when I give them talks about this in seminars around Britain. He said, you will travel all over the world with this book. And I thought, my heavens, I never dreamed of anything like that. And it turned out to be true.
You said it's been translated into...
Well, I know there were at least 8 editions in Mexico alone.
Good.
Mainly South America, because that's where you've got a large literate tertiary education population. And of course it's read in English in places like India and so forth. Never got translated to French. I mean, the barrier between us and Paris is still intellectual barrier, absolutely alarming. That's one of the things I resented about the later developments in New Left Review. They worshipped everything on the South Bank, the latest emanations, whether Althusser or Derrida or... I don't. And only very recently I've had a translation to French of Trumpet Shall Sound. Not for anything else, ever. Nor have I ever received an invitation to speak in France. Nor Germany, for that matter. I've been all over the Third World, largely as a result of that book.
How would you reconcile those two things, that it was in France that it was discovered? It was Guru, was it, or who was it who put forward the idea of the three worlds?
It was a Politico, it was Claude Bourdet. The term was coined by Alfred Sauvy, who was a demographer.
Yes.
I'm not sure, did he get a Nobel Prize? He was a very distinguished one. He coined it in 1952, and it became taken up and used in French political circles that I was associated with. That's how I probably read about it ahead of anybody else in England, because those early New Left days we had our opposite numbers in France. The whole concept of the democratic left was analogous to that old Trotskyite slogan, neither Moscow nor Washington, but more positive. We want to stand for democratic socialism, radical democratic socialism. And Claude Bourdet of Nouvel Observateur, editor, whom I met on various occasions, also through CND, international things, took up the notion of tiers-monde, and I learned about this concept from the French. And it seemed to make sense of something new entity that was forming under our eyes. And by 1955, of course, we had the Bandung non-aligned conference. There had been a whole series of predecessors and postcessors. It was a new... the publishers put on the cover of my Third World book, I didn't put it on, a subtitle saying, "A Vital New Force in International Affairs." I wouldn't have made anything quite as strident as that out of it, but they did, and I think they were right, because that's how we saw it at the time, and it was. It was an extremely important breakthrough. Immensely important, even in merest terms of the masses of population involved. You know, India, China, Nehru, Nasser, and Nkrumah, and the connections that were being made to even through to Europe with Tito, and even to Britain with Naurin Bevan used to go and talk to Tito and Nehru, and they had known each other a long time. A new force in the world seemed to be taking place, and I guess I was so excited about it, although I hope I've documented it intellectually carefully enough, that some of that must have communicated itself, certainly to many, many people have said to me, "Oh, we read this at UNAM in Mexico, and it really changed my life," and that's rather encouraging.
How do you write? Was it written in a great sort of burst of
steam
in a short period? It was just
a couple of vacations, I think, from one summer vacation through the next one, and another vacations, and in between. It was written white heat.
Do you work like that?
Philip Larkin told me that. It says a very passionate book.
That's nice. You just, once you start writing, you like to just...
If I've got something really, yes. I don't really like to write unless I've got something to say. I don't write like people have to these days, and Americans seem to do it all too often anyhow, simply to fill up their CVs. It's a great tragedy. I mean, the publish or perish syndrome. The rubbish is churned out exponentially. No, I write when I got something to say. Now at the moment I think I can feel the germs. It's like a kind of sexual itch. Oh, another book coming up inside. I thought I'd stopped, but I can see another one coming because I feel I've got something to say.
Well, you at some point in your magnum opus, The Three Worlds, you sort of imply this is your life's work and this is the last thing, but it sounds as if it is.
Well, I thought I'd said everything there. But do you want me to talk about it?
Well, just finishing the Third World, you've sort of reflected retrospectively on other things and suggested ways in which you would alter. I know you were encouraged to rewrite it, and after one re-edition you then decided you couldn't because things had changed too much.
Yeah.
What had changed? You said you yourself had changed, the world had changed, and the Third World had changed. What was it really that changed and made
Well, that great non-aligned movement died back. it still persists and exists, but in much attenuated and restricted form. There is, and I've had first-hand experience of it, a very vital presence of the more radical third world, and it now embraces not only the radicals, but really every country, in the form of the non-aligned group in the United Nations in Manhattan, about 125 of them. And they are a significant presence there. Jean Kirkpatrick used to go crazy because Americans can't control the UN anymore. Even the third world can do it on its own. They can get a vote through, but if they get a few allies from the second world bloc, which they often can on crucial issues, then they're home and dry. Then, of course, nothing happens because it will be either positively vetoed or just ignored. No funds provided. But it is important. But I think, whereas it was a political force, I mean, therefore it is stymied at the UN. There's very little it can do. It can exert moral pressure. And I've seen empty meetings at UN myself on Namibia, which I've been one of the 4 people in the audience in the council chamber. So one shouldn't exaggerate how important those victories are at UN. But in 1964, of course, it became rapidly apparent, and people like Nyerere have said, they came to power thinking that they were going to change the economy and lift their people up and give them decent standards of living. And so he said we hadn't the slightest idea. We hadn't got an economic program. We thought we could do without an army too. And then we found Idi Amin. He said we had no idea of the power of the great multinational corporations and our impotence to control world prices for our raw materials, our exports. And he said, increasingly, we found out. And so that by 1964, the political independence of most of the African countries only won in 61, 2 or 3 years before. They soon found out they couldn't do anything. In fact, in many ways, getting worse. I remember citing the instance of Ghana doubling its cocoa production by the time when prices went down by half. So they're exactly where they started, having worked twice as hard, twice as effectively. So they began seeing the problem as one of an economic one, of global market, and of the power of the transnational corporations. And that's the point in 1964, from the first UNCTAD conference onwards, the non-aligned increasingly saw that what held them in common was all that plus debt. And therefore became predominantly a movement of resistance, a lot of it verbal, to the economic hegemony of the West. And the West particularly, rather than the Second World, didn't matter all that much. So, and that's what it remains to this day. So that's it's a very significant shift. But I think that's basically what's happened to the Third World today.
That's why it was not worth bringing out new editions of the book, because it had shifted in this way.
Yes, and of course, the events of formative period in the 50s and 60s become more and more remote. You can't go on writing. So I waited a long time, you see. I valued my time, and also I felt I hadn't done a good enough intellectual job. It was a very pioneering operation, mental shoestrap operation. I mean, my chapter on nationalism was not very good at all. And so I just sat down and gradually equipped myself, I guess. I did all this work on the rural Third World, agrarian Third World, helped much by Theodore, and Brian introduced me to Latin America. Eventually I got, after 14 agonizing years, never getting a chance to to be away from Manchester for more than a few weeks. Couldn't have done any anthropological, sustained work, extended work. I was then sentenced to being dean for 2 years, which is a final degradation and rendering of sterility of any intellectual, though I quite enjoyed it. And I got a year off. And I decided that I write about the Third World. I knew about Africa, I knew something about Asia from my Indian days. But I knew nothing about South America. So I took myself off to Ecuador under the influence of one of my postgraduate students, learned myself Spanish, and that opened a new world, a new dimension. And of course there you've got a very rich intellectual tradition, the literature, sociological literature from Chile, And Argentina and Brazil, the Southern Cone, was enormous before the dictators came along. And one met all those refugees all over the place, in Mexico and in Ecuador. Mexico has a hugely impressive anthropological tradition. It goes back to the days of indigenismo in the 30s, the revolution. It's a revolutionary tradition, heritage. And so I learned that you didn't need to... that all these theories about Gunda Frankenstein, about underdevelopment or revolution, that postulated precisely that there could be no development in the Third World, which at first I rather naively swallowed like everybody else. I used to go choking to work in Mexico City from the car fumes and the industrial pollution, and I say to myself, underdevelopment? Or in Sao Paulo, or in Rio, where blue canyons of smoke from the patent development of an industrial kind. So I started to research and to read about this industrial development in Mexico and Brazil, and by that time, having Spanish and Portuguese, I could do it.
You learned Portuguese as well?
Yeah. So that equipped me on the industrial front. Agrarian, industrial, but I remain deep down in my fibres an anthropologist, and I'm never happy about the totality which purports to resource the world of sociological or economic or other theories, and I'm interested in the cultural, and that's ultimately where I came more and more back to it through almost unlikely people like Marshall Salins, was a big influence.
Which that was
Well,
culture and practical reason.
Yeah, culture and practical reason particularly, yes.
Which you say has never been answered by Marxists.
I don't think they've answered it. I've read a long piece, I remember in Dialectical Anthropology by Bridget McLaughlin. I don't think it takes Marshall for pieces at all. Because I don't think you can. And so I came back and I read a lot about culture, including the conceptualization of culture. I went back to old works that Cliff Geertz had written in 1940 and all kinds of things. And I think he mystifies it, absolutizes it, reifies it. Now that was also unsatisfactory, but at least recognizes which were important and its persistence. So that's why that theme occurs so powerfully in Three Worlds, which didn't in the Third World, except implicitly.
Perhaps if we turn to the Three Worlds, which is obviously a summation, at least when you wrote it you thought it was a summation of all your wisdom. There were three in the prolegomena anyway. There were four things that I wondered whether you could, themes that interested me particularly. One was your criticism, we talked about a little bit, the criticism of world system theory, Wallerstein. What was it that, was it the case of something which at first you found terribly refreshing and exciting and overwhelming, and then you began to doubt it, or were you doubtful?
Yes, I'm very attracted by it. I think anyone must be. Patently, a world system has emerged. Since at least 1885, I think that's about the date of its consolidation. Clearly, even in the communist world, prices of consumer goods and all kinds of commodities are affected by what happens in Chicago, New York, and the commodity exchanges and the shares that are being sold down in the city here or in Manhattan. In that sense, it can't be controverted. But the crunch came for me in an actual concrete occasion. We're in Berlin, where I'm going to do the same thing in a few months' time. And Henri Gunda Frank, who I know well, and Manuel Wallerstein were there up on the platform with me. And somebody entitled the symposium, One World or Three. At least that was the title of my paper. And of course I took the line, there were three. And Gunda, amongst this huge audience of radical young German students, said, "Peter," he said, "you've got it just 100% arse about face." And maybe it was a bit of pique, but I didn't think intellectually I was wrong. And therefore I went home in Berlin, and I read Wallerstein through comma by comma, everything I could lay hands on, and I decided, what it seemed to be saying. This is quite difficult to grasp him, actually. And write a critique of it, what I thought was wrong with it. And I did that and published it in the Socialist Register. It's interesting. Minimal response. Zero response from Emmanuel, whom I love dearly as a friend and a politico, but I'm still unconvinced about the validity of this model. It's damn sight better than Gunther Frank's model, which is simply bipolar and postulates an equally antinomian set of choices under development or revolution. One might have argued revolution was a serious one in the days when there had been the Chinese Revolution and the Vietnamese, which defeated the most powerful country in human history, but not lately. In fact, counter-revolution's been doing quite well, thank you. So Wallerstein's model is much better insofar as it has core, the unit building blocks, core, periphery, but also semi-periphery. And it recognizes the possibility of transition from one status to another. Now, getting back to that pollution in Mexico City and Rio, I'd also been to Hong Kong, and have been again recently, absolutely shattered at the transformation in 16 years. You've got to ask yourself the question, is this the third world anymore? And I don't think it is in Hong Kong. Of course not. But there are a lot of countries which are also labelled nowadays newly industrializing. The four little tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Singapore, and in South America, Mexico and Brazil, to name no others. Now, so impressive has their performance been, although the vulnerability of the Brazilian economy is considerable, given their massive debt, and Mexican, that someone like Nigel Harris writes a book for Penguins entitled The End of the Third World. And I still think it exists. I think it's a bit premature, like Mark Twain's death. At first I began to think, well, am I behind the times? I started reading about the new International Division of Labour, which German writers and others have written about. And going to Hong Kong, I was able to pick up and refresh myself on what's been happening. Jeffrey Henderson's wonderful book on the semiconductor industry in Hong Kong, which is coming out shortly. And yes, there's a new International Division of Labour. Yes, many of these newly industrializing countries are no longer any meaningful criterion third world. They're not agrarian, certainly. Dependency, we could argue about. That, I think, is wildly exaggerated. To all countries are interdependent to some degree or other, and dependent. So, nevertheless, I don't find it satisfactory to assume the third world has disappeared. Now, this is a sleight of hand. Out of all the entire spectrum of countries which could be designated or have been designated third world, such as those that are in the World Bank's annual reports, you pick 6 that have indeed industrialized themselves and become export platforms and so forth. And you assume that this is the wave of the future for everywhere. At least it's implicit, but never perhaps explicit in Nigel Harris or other people. That's a hell of an assumption. Intellectually, one can make that kind of argument. Then practically, I thought by pure coincidence, I went to Latin America again recently. And when I got to Peru, I realized it wasn't just an intellectual conviction, that Peru is a very different kettle of fish indeed. In fact, it's a broken-backed society, and I don't think it's going to last very long, with tremendous problems, which are those of the third world, and that there's absolutely no imminent logic that will take it in the direction of even Mexico. Yes, these countries have to a degree diversified themselves, a greater sized manufacturing sector and so forth and so on, but in crucial ways they are exhibit the syndrome that we've always talked about as of dependent development or underdevelopment. Black Africa is going backwards in the conventional terms of measurement of development. All the indices would show a 6% decrease in the value of African exports in the last few years. It's being dropped off as a kind of basket case by the West, which doesn't really care a damn about black Africa. Now, you've worked in Nepal, and you know that the World Bank distinguishes between poor, middling poor, and very poor, or poor, poorer, poorest. And there are degrees of poverty. And there are still large numbers of countries in those categories. And that's objectively speaking. That's our intellectual perception of them, if you like. They too see themselves still as third world. That's why they belong to the non-aligned grouping. And so, without beating around the bush too long, I still think that there is a significantly sized world, a third world still. And that to that extent, any immanentist models like that of Harris, or models that, I don't know what Emmanuel would argue about these things, but it's much more unclear. Any immanentist models are just fatuous.
Would you think that your reaction to Wallerstein and the fact that you are both concerned with the global economy spreading from the West and also the native perceptions and the way they shaped and altered it is something to do with the fact that you've been an anthropologist and you've been at the receiving end and watched the way small societies and bigger societies shape what hits them? So you do.
Absolutely. I mean, these are very brilliant people like Emmanuel Wallerstein. Most scholarly, perceptive, experienced, all kinds of things. They've never been exposed to that, really, though. I mean, I worked with a society, it wasn't even the whole society of 450 people, it was about 250 that I was allowed to study. And that's difficult, because it's a rich culture. And so I have been regressing, if you like, to my original interests. And I now think it's extremely important, yes, to be aware of Hong Kong, but also to be aware that the people in Hong Kong are Chinese. They have a culture too, and it certainly isn't that of Western Europe, nor are their values, as many studies bring out. They're also that China has a very different kind of ideology. Chinese, though they may be, they're also overlaid with quite a history now of communist ideology. And that's all going to be. So ideologies, cultural value systems, do not either correspond one-to-one with contemporary social structures. They also persist, they get transformed, but they exist. And they exist and have to be therefore taken into account in addition to political structures and economic institutions. Now, most political scientists and economists have absolutely no understanding of what the hell on earth one means by, or the relevance of cultural institutions and value systems. They wouldn't even begin to know how to go about understanding them. It doesn't enter their intellectual universe. And I think it's about time we stop this nonsense. And I want to go back now and write a book about other knowledges. And I don't know exactly what form it's going to take now, but it's going to be profoundly influenced by my dear missionary colleague, Dr. Waddy, whom I've never met. And we'll talk about Australian Aboriginal, as a type case study, Australian Aboriginal knowledge, or knowledge is plural, types of knowledge they have about the natural world around them. I'd like to talk about knowledge of the world beyond this world that most of us in a secular culture don't believe in. It exists, but it's real to people who believe in it and have most elaborate and sophisticated, involuted indeed, ideas about it. I'd like to talk about a fascinating study I read recently about the procedures used by Micronesian islanders to navigate across the wastes of the Pacific. How the hell they do it? What is the knowledge of the stars, of the heavenly bodies, and what techniques do they use, which is extremely sophisticated and acute and perceptive. And in general relate that to this very much wider theme that you touched upon about the necessity to understand how other peoples, including peoples you normally get labelled primitive or underdeveloped or illiterate or pre-literate and so on. Their cultures are extremely complex and persist, but also that's an extreme. These tiny microcultures. There are gigantic cultures that persist, like Iranian Islam or Chinese-ness, whatever that might be, which you've got to come to terms with. And I don't think that China eventually quarrelled with their loyalist allies and their supporters, the Soviet Union, is simply a question of differences of Marxist ideology. It's got something to do, too, with the nature of the difference between Russian-dominated society and culture and Chinese society and culture.
Can I lead on from that to another theme in the book? I remember Ernest Gellner either writing or saying to me that Marx has been replaced by Weber as the leading world sociologist. He probably put it more elegantly than that, but there is a sort of one part of the Prolegomena which stresses how, having abandoned a sort of base superstructure determinist model, then one turns with relief to Weber, a sort of, and reads him again and finds that somehow he's managed to link things, and as all anthropologists want to do, see some holism, some connections, without forcing the mind to go in one direction or another. Is that what you found in Weber? Or?
That's what's attractive about him. Well, incredible genius. One hesitates to dare criticise him, but he raises the problem of Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. There's some kind of relationship between these two historical processes, the emergence of each respectively, and what the devil is the nature of the relationship. All kinds of commentaries have been written and criticisms of the way he went about it, methodologically, empirically, and so forth. How did he identify, select, categorize the Protestant ethic on the basis of what? Text by Baxter and Puritan divines and so on. What's the relation between that and, say, existential popular Protestantism in Geneva? There are all kinds of problems, but he raised the problematic. Marx was aware of it too. There are bits tucked away in his little letters and things, but it wasn't central. The logic of capital was what he talked about, talking about production. And that isn't enough. So whatever shortcomings Weber might have, and whatever differences there are in the works and the emphases that the late Weber and the early Weber wrote about on this topic, which is quite considerable, I think the problematic is that he had the genius to erase it, and no one can evade it.
Yes. Which again links in with the other theme, which is the cultural. I mean, obviously I wondered whether it was you were thinking it. I mean, trying to explain why there's obviously a rapid shift going on in your own mind and your own heart, and it's partly encapsulated there. But talking to you, I can see it's going faster and faster towards away from economic determinism and early interpretations of Marxism towards a much more interest in ideas, aesthetics, cultural influences, perceptions, and all these things. Now, it could be related to your anthropological streak. It could be related to your early schooling and education, history and English, which were the subjects you first studied. It could be that the world again is changing, and we can see much more clearly now the influence of culture. I mean, anyone who isn't aware now of the enormous influence of communications, of art, of symbolic systems as portrayed in the media, of photography, of film, of all these sort of cultural things, as well as religion, would be blind. It may not have been so obvious 10 years ago, but it's hitting us in the face. Which of those, do you think it's all those?
I think all those are significant, but I think probably the most, perhaps you didn't mention it explicitly, is firstly Marxism itself, which I was cleaved to in my former reincarnation, has experienced disastrous pluralization. I don't think you can talk about Marxism now. You can only talk about Marxism as plural. There are many varieties, national varieties, Chinese, Soviet, and so forth. And one could classify Marxism in other ways. I distinguish between Promethean ones, which set out to change the world, and determinist ones that simply regard the world as a place that is determined by the logic of the economy, and all kinds of other ways. And these are not just distinctions I make, there are distinctions out there in the world that are battled over, the subjects of causes, bases of tremendous struggles, intellectual struggles and political struggles. People kill each other to take one side or the other. They go to war. So these Marxism has exploded into a number of varieties. It has also been savagely, its credibility was savagely undermined by the Stalinist experience and a lot of other experiences. Pol Pot. Appalling. And I think maybe even more frightening, and as frightening in the Sendero Luminoso form if it comes to power, which I think it might. That's one. The second is, of course, the eruption back onto the world scene of dead ideologies like Islam. Part of the past, wasn't it? Not at all. Heavens alive, 12 European governments have just had to cut off diplomatic relations because of the Salman Rushdie book. The power of a regenerated, not authentic or traditional, it's not a fundamentalist continuity from the past. I think you and I might argue about this possibly, as it's a specific reading of Islam and a very modern one. I think the Quran does not say that government should be in the hands of the mullahs, and etc. etc. But it's there. And it is an instance of the most macro, transnational level of the persistence of deeply rooted, historically rooted cultural themes and visions, world visions. So I think my response to increasing resensitization back towards an anthropological interest in culture is a response not just very much to the conditioned by these huge changes in what's happening to large ideologies in the world, not just the small ones on Groot Island.
Can I just end, perhaps, since we've kept you so long, on two things. One is these sound like obituary type things, but what of the things that you've ever done, either writing or in action, do you feel, how shall I say, happiest or most proud or most fulfilled at having done one single thing?
I remember it was John Freeman asking this question of Bertrand Russell, and he expected the answer writing a Principia Mathematica, and he said, my passionate relations with three different women. And I might almost say the same, but I won't. I'm not brave enough. I'm intellectual, and I value intellectual work, and I value what I've tried to do, and so I obviously value the major things I've done, which is Trumpet Chausseur, Third World, Three Worlds, and a number of other things too. And I'm proud of those with all their shortcomings, and I hope I do some more, better. But, as this long interview has shown, I'm a political animal. I guess always will be, though sickened by what's happened to the left. Nevertheless, I'm also extremely proud of what I think was probably a heroic phase in my political life, was the phase of the early formative years of breaking with Stalinism, but not just breaking with Stalinism, creating something new. We had that period of the creation of the new left, and the rise of CND, which was one of the most inspiring things I've ever known, and came back to a second coming a few years ago.
Yes.
And I'm happy to have been involved in that, played some role. Not just in universities.
Well, the other question, I suppose, is what, if other things had been different, what is it that you most would have liked to have done, and you may still do, but is the sort of avenue you didn't go down? Which
What do you mean? Well, there are all kinds of avenues one didn't go down. I can think of some. I was nearly forced with the position of leaving anthropology in Australia and having to earn a living, honestly. And I remember Ken Burridge was in the same position. He actually went to some interviews in business. And where are you going to earn a living as some kind of educated professional? It would be in public administration or in private sector. One might well have done that. I actually think I would have been quite interested. I find public bureaucracy absolutely fascinating. And I think the world of industry and business is also fascinating. I think I could have done that, though I would presumably try to remain very alienated from it, as a lot of people are who are in it, including the whole of the labour movement. I think possibly too, if other things being equal, I might well have gone off, as so many people have done, and instead of pursuing an academic career writing about the third world, try to do something in the third world, like volunteers do, go and work for aid agencies and so forth. The great barrier or impediment to that is, of course, that in fact most of us are so saturated, involved in our own culture. We're married, we have relatives here, we have kids to bring up. We don't do it. That's what I mean. I'm very impressed by the number of anthropologists who go off and to the field in Borneo and Amazon and so on, and that is what one should be doing in one's life. Meet them 7 years later, and they're arguing that Rottenstall is a terribly interesting place in Lancashire, or southern Quebec, or some other place where they happen to be living at the moment. And why do they happen to be living? Because the kids are going to school there. And I've seen this amongst Dutch and Canadian and American and English, and to know that it is a pattern. That unless you're prepared to sacrifice the life of your children in our cultural terms, their educational career, which as we all know has got to start as fast as possible, then anthropologists suddenly start finding it absolutely imperative to study the West. And I think that is a bit of false consciousness. What did Sartre call it?
The last tiny question: have you ever been bored? I mean, you seem such a vital and interested in everything, with enormous enthusiasm.
Well, I mean, there were long stretches in the army, and where one is, after all, confined to camp a lot of the time, doing routine and not very interesting things. I'm bored. But luckily I was able to escape from them.
You were learning Swahili.
I was learning Swahili, or occasionally getting out to Nairobi, or talking to the Africans or something. Yeah, there were stretches of boredom, of ennui.
But you certainly don't seem to be now.
Not since I left the army. The army can be very boring.
The rest is fun.
Yeah.
Well, Peter, thank you very